Right, as it's already gone 6:30, and I've got the right paperwork to read out at the beginning. I am Councillor Paul Frankham, the Chair of the Scrutiny Committee, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the meeting, which is being held virtually and in accordance with the Council rules for virtual meetings, which reflects the recent published government regulations. The meeting is being streamed live on YouTube and will be also available to view after the meeting is finished. Councillors who sit on the committee are identified by name on the screen, and I will introduce the officers by name before the committee address them. Councillors are reminded that all this meeting is being remotely. There are regards to being present in a meeting of the council, and they should observe the rules of behaviour under the members' code of conduct and not allow other members of the household to distract them. During the course of the meeting, can members ensure the mobile phones are switched off and or on silent? Members of the committee will turn on their video link during the meeting, keep their microphones up muted unless they've been invited to speak by myself as chair. Members are reminded that if they switch off the video link or move away from the camera, they'll be treated as leaving the meeting and not be able to take part in the vote taken on under that item agenda discussion. Members can indicate they wish to speak by raising hand. Should only speak when I, as chair, invite them to do so. The officers present will only switch their video link on during the item they're prepared to presenting, or they wish to be invited to speak by the chair. As chair, I will confirm the name of any visiting speakers at the appropriate time in the agenda who will address the committee by audio link. Councillors should declare that they're leaving the meeting and switch off the video link if they have a disclosable pecuniary interest or other personal interest in an item on the agenda. The councillors can switch on their video link when I call the next agenda item. Votes will be taken by a roll call and will confirm recommendations to the committee before the vote begins. Can each member indicate they are for or against the recommendation or wish to abstain? Hopefully we will not have any IT issues, but I remind councillors that if the connection is lost, that they immediately advise the Democratic Service Support Officer and use the link to access the meeting again. Right, okay. That's that bit over. Okay, so I'll now turn to the agenda. There's still a couple of people short, but hopefully they'll catch up with us. Okay, apologies for absence. I have two substitutions. Councillor Paul Harvey has replaced Councillor David Potter, so I'm looking forward to his contributions. And Councillor Nick Robinson has replaced Councillor Tony Coupon. So they're the two nominations. Are any other apologies or substitutions? No, okay. Are there any declarations of interest? No. Okay, under item 3, when we elected the vice chair, I asked the officers to go away and check, as Councillor Miller queried. Basically, I should have checked there was no Tory no Tory available to be vice chair before taking the vote, because if there is no administration member willing to take the post, anyone from the council can take, any councillor can take it. So are people happy to continue on the way we are, or do you want to start the vote again?
I'm happy.
So am I, as you mentioned me, Chairman, quite happy to continue as we are.
Yeah,
okay, thank you very much. So Councillor Kim Taylor, you will continue as Vice Chair. And thank you for your input today at the yesterday at the pre-meeting. Item 4, minutes. There are no other items. Item 4, minutes of the meeting held on 21st of July. Are they all correct? Okay.
Agreed.
Agreed.
Thank you. Item 5, Basingstoke and Dean COVID response. Item 5. I believe the leader will start that off, then followed by Tom Payne. So if Councillor Rattigan would like to make his presentation.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all you councillors, especially to full council who asked for this review and response on the lessons learned in our COVID response to what is a challenging and difficult situation, and obviously with today's news it's become more challenging and certainly more difficult, and I'm sure in your debate tonight you will reflect upon what's been done in terms of preparation for the future. I would just like to at this point express my thanks to all of you councillors who have emailed me, come up with some suggestions as to how we can act during this. Although I'm leader of the council, I do not feel that I was alone in this, or that the administration were separate from you as councillors. And I would, as there are two group leaders on this call, I'd like to thank both Andy and Ian for their support during a tense time, if I'm honest. Firstly, because it was difficult to get to grips with what was happening. It was unknown in the extent, in the impact, and in what would be the compliance of the residents of Basingstoke and Dean. And I feel immensely proud, as I'm sure all of you feel, in the communities that rallied round and helped, not just people close to them or people that they knew or family members, but people who were strangers to them at the beginning of COVID and who have now become firmer friends. And there is a reliance upon that community spirit that I hope, as we move into a second wave, that will continue. And I give you all the confidence that we as administration will not be found lacking, both in determination to get through this, but also when there is a requirement for money, we will find a way. I say that, because the humanitarian, the resident use of money has been amazing. People have stepped up and done deliveries, set up community centres to distribute both help and food to many, and therefore I feel there is a responsibility on us as the administration to make sure their commitment is backed by the commitment of this administration. So the report is in front of you tonight, and I'm here to make sure that you don't just question that report that's had my endorsement and my support, but of course there will be questions about perhaps mistakes that we've made, and I would say that we didn't get it right all the time, and I would hold my hand up to that. Perhaps we didn't act quickly enough to provide BVA with the support that they required, but that was not because we did not believe in them. It's just because we did not initially have the processes ready to be able to be quicker off the mark. So I apologize for the bits I got wrong. I hope you will understand that that was always going to happen in something that was new to us, new to the country, and new to our residents. But look, I'm going to hand you over to Rebecca now, who's going to lead the first part of the report, and I'm sure Tom Payne will pick up some of the other bits. But thank you for your help and support.
Thank you, Councillor Ratcliffe. Has anyone got a quick question for Mr. Ratcliffe before we move on? Okay, if Rebecca would like to. Councillor Miller, do you have a quick question?
Yeah, the leader referred to the report. Which report? I can't find agenda item number 5 in our pack, or am I missing?
Tom's gonna. I think Tom's gonna lead. I don't know how Democratic Services got it to you, so I believe there is Tom and Rebecca are going to lead you through the report that I've seen, and I hope they will.
It was a supplementary agenda which was sent electronically, and then the presentation was resent to you all yesterday electronically as well. So it's the presentation, Councillor Miller.
I got the presentation. It was just the report that was referred
to.
Well,
it's essentially a report about. Sorry, my apologies for getting the words wrong, Paul. But rest assured, if there are any questions come out of that, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Rebecca was going to talk next.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and good evening, members. So, yeah, just to be clear, it is a presentation, and our apologies that was circulated later, but the reason that we did so was to make sure that the figures and the statistics within it were the most up-to-date that we could provide you with, hence why it was circulated to the committee a little later than the agenda was published. So just to give a very brief overview, and then I'll hand over to Tom Payne and officers to take you all through the presentation this evening. So what's in front of the committee tonight is an overview of the Council's response to the pandemic. As part of the presentation, officers have given an overview of how the Council structured itself to respond, the work streams that we set up to enable us to deliver, the milestones and achievements within the last 7 months, and any lessons that we can take forward from that learning. And as I was just saying, we'll also give an overview to the committee of some of the case numbers within the borough and then the wider Hampshire area, which hopefully you'll find useful. So as I said, the presentation tonight, Scrutiny, is a general overview of the Council's response. But in response to the motion at full Council, other committees are also examining specific areas of the Council's response in more detail. So EPH have already received work on the Economic Recovery Framework, and CEP are also considering what further information they would like to receive in relation to the Council's support to the community and vulnerable residents. So we haven't gone into those work streams in great detail, but we can pick up any questions the committee might have around them. The final thing I just wanted to say, and the leader has already briefly touched on this, is that clearly we're all very aware that this afternoon there have been a number of significant announcements from government. Clearly the presentation that we put for the committee tonight is a retrospective look at the Council's work during the pandemic, so we haven't focused on the announcements today during this evening's presentation, but if there are any questions we'll try and pick up what we can. So I think what I'd like to do now, Chair, through you, is just hand over to Tom Payne and officers to take the committee through the presentation.
Okay, just before we go to Tom Payne, he did say to take questions as it goes along, but if we get too bogged down with questions, but if they can be on the subject he's actually talking about, right, and then he will take questions at the end as well. So if you've got a burning question at the time, please do ask it, and Tom will do his best to answer it. Thank you. If Tom would like to make his presentation now, please.
Right, good evening, councillors. Hopefully you can see the presentation on the screen now. As Rebecca's just outlined, this obviously follows the motion to full council, and obviously what we'll work through in the presentation is provide you with an overview effectively of the council's response to COVID-19, effectively the structure that we have in place to deliver the response appropriately, and how that sort of interlinks with other key agencies across Hampshire particularly, but also nationally in government level. I will hand over to my colleague Di Bromley, who's going to give an overview of the timeline, so some slides around the timeline. Sally Boxall is also supporting with the presentation, and she will take us through the slides on the incidence of COVID across the borough. And then it'll come back to me and we'll cover the lessons identified, summary effectively of the Hampshire Local Outbreak Control Plan, and sort of moving forward. So that's the brief structure. What I was proposing to do is more or less pause at key points throughout the presentation, and if anyone has any sort of points of clarification, more than happy to take those as we go through this. So there, as you appreciate, for emergency planning response point of view, there are very established procedures and plans in place. Obviously, we as a council have our own overarching emergency response plan, which guides us as to how we respond to any kind of civil emergency in the borough. But clearly, pandemic flu is one of those top 5 effectively risks that exists nationally, and we have across Hampshire specific plans which deal with how we would respond to a pandemic, and it is a plan that is tested regularly. I think, in fact, across the LRF area, across Hampshire, the plan was tested back in December, before the outbreak really came to light. So there are established plans in place across the county. We had our own plan as well, which was developed back in 2017. So you know, these established plans were put into effect effectively. So this slide basically shows the response structure that we put in place, and this goes right back to sort of February, tail part of February, where we set up this response structure to control the council's response to the pandemic and to deliver the key sort of work streams that were associated with it. I'll take you through each of these particular groups in the following slides, but certainly at the height, you know, some of these groups are meeting every day, including at weekends. We had various catch-ups and work was ongoing clearly over weekends as well. So that's the overarching structure. If we look at the strategic emergency management team, obviously it's chaired by the Chief Executive and supported by the Executive Director for Residents Services. And these are the key responsibilities that that particular group has. So it's a strategic response. It's coordinating our response with partners through the Local Resilience Forum, making sure we've got effective communications with members, staff, the public and businesses, planning for the recovery phase, and overseeing our sort of business continuity arrangements. Making sure that financial procedures were implemented appropriately, and making sure that governance procedures were followed as well, and providing that sort of community leadership. So that they were the overarching sort of responsibilities for the strategic group. As I mentioned, a key part of this is the sort of liaison with key partners through the Local Resilience Forum. So this is a collective group of representatives from all the different agencies across Hampshire: police, fire service, health colleagues, Hampshire County Council, all the districts. You know, a lot of different organisations are represented at in different groups. And so there have been regular meetings, obviously, through the Local Resilience Forum and some of the particular work streams, which I'll just cover in a few slides' time. It's a multi-agency group, and the idea behind, obviously, the Local Resilience Forum is that we have a shared understanding of the current picture, what the incidence is of COVID across the county specifically, work collaboratively to provide support to our communities and work in that sort of partnership fashion. So the very first strategic coordinating group meeting for the Local Resilience Forum was set up on the 3rd of March, chaired by the Directors of Public Health, and a major incident was declared across Hampshire on the 18th of March. This was, we were one of the first Local Resilience Forum areas effectively to declare this as a major incident, but certainly within the next week to 10 days, I think all Local Resilience Forums across the whole country had also recognised that this was a major incident for them as well, and that arrangement was put in place. That effectively opens up the communication channels with national government, who attend and sit on some of those discussions, those strategic meetings. So it opens up that sort of communication channel directly with government, but also brings into play sort of the military assistance that might be required in a sort of major incident response. Just to mention, so this is the most complicated response structure that has ever been put in place for a response to an emergency planning incident of this nature, clearly, and the longest. So it's been in place now for 9 months so far. So this I won't go through this in detail, but it was just really to highlight the complexity really of the various different work streams. So you have a strategic coordinating group, and there are various leads for those particular work streams and priorities for the Local Resilience Forum. There are 5 priorities that are mentioned here: preventing the spread of infection, protecting critical services, protecting the vulnerable, public confidence and order, and the restore and recovery work stream. And there's a strategic lead from various organisations for those particular work streams, leading particular work activities around them. There's a tactical coordinating group, and that's really coordinating the delivery of some of the activities at a local level. And as you can see there were various different other groups set up to support the response to this incident. And we had representation on most of these groups, and some of these were meeting twice weekly and sometimes more frequently than that. So there was a lot of liaison going on across the county. This is the recovery structure. Again, I won't dwell on this too much, but again, a key theme for us, particularly as we entered into sort of June time, was around stepping into recovery, supporting businesses and supporting the community to the new normal. So that was just a quick canter through the LRF structure that was put in place and effectively how we linked into that. Obviously, the key achievements for us as a strategic group were the fact that we have the good liaison with government and elected representatives at all levels, and working with those key agencies throughout the pandemic. Regular updates were provided to elected members throughout our response, and I know we were highlighted, I think it's from the LGA, as an example of good practice in terms of the regularity of those updates to councillors and keeping everyone as informed as we possibly could. Early on, we were called to ask and supported to identify potential Nightingale hospital sites, should that be required, which we did, and a number of those potential sites were put on standby. And we've also had a huge role really in terms of identifying and helping to set up the local drive-through COVID-19 testing sites. So we have obviously the one at the leisure park, and we have another one on Viables, but an awful lot of work that goes on behind the scenes to make those arrangements and put those in place. We also were able to support the Camrose, Gillies and Hackwood partnership to set up a COVID assessment drive-through site to support GP practices and to see effectively triage patients who felt they were suffering with COVID symptoms and give them appropriate advice in those circumstances. So that was us providing the venue for them to use, supporting with provision of bollards and cones and radios, etc. So very, very supportive of that initiative. We're also able to support with the provision of free parking for the NHS and care workers in our car parks, but also providing permits so they could park in residential areas without fear of receiving a penalty notice. So just picking up on the issue around keeping people informed, this was a slide that just shows a snapshot really of the activity that took place in terms of sharing information and keeping people informed. I just obviously draw your attention to this was a particular period in time. So this refers to the 16th of March through to the end of July. Obviously, there's been a lot more that's happened since the end of July, but this was just a snapshot in that period. But it just goes to show, I think, that a huge amount of effort was put in through our communications team to share key information with relevant parties, whether residents, businesses, etc., and keep people as informed as we possibly could. A number of videos were also compiled in terms of showing what some of the staff were actively involved with. A number of staff.
Tom, I've just got Councillor Kim Taylor would like to ask a quick question. You have to unmute, Kim.
Right, okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, oh, excellent. Thanks very much, Tom. I just wanted to go back to that sort of previous slide on keeping people informed. I mean, there was clearly quite a lot of good work there. What specifically did we do in relation to specific parts of our community in terms of communication? For example, the BAME community that might have non-English speaking sectors that might not understand, you know, generally what's going on because their English, you know, their first language isn't English, and similarly for the deaf community who's first language is also not English, but sign language. Did we have any provision for that?
Yeah, as you're probably aware, obviously we have Equalities and Diversity Officer within the council, and he was in regular contact with a lot of key groups and representatives of sections of our community, and making sure that the information that was being shared was being received by those particular groups and understood by them. So there was support being provided through that channel, if you like, directly by an officer with his particular links to the various communities to ensure that they had read, also received and understood the advice at a local level. Okay.
Carry on, Tom, thanks.
Yeah. So this was just to highlight some of the videos that were done, showing some of the different activities that some of the staff were involved with. I'll just pick out an example from my own team, effectively, in terms of parking, where instead of patrolling the streets for parking contraventions, a lot of the civil enforcement staff were actually out supporting with the community hubs and delivering food parcels and medicines, etc., to sort of support that sort of community response. But there were a whole series of videos here just showing some of the routine activities of the staff during that time. Just moving on to the particular work group around economic and welfare support, which was led by the Executive Director for Finance and Resources. This is a particular work group that was focusing on the measures and the support we were providing to businesses, but also in terms of the support we're providing to individuals, the voluntary organisations and community groups. And I won't go through them all in detail, but again, they were the key themes. It's the support we could provide to businesses and to individuals. The highlights and some of the key things that we were able to achieve through as a local authority: £33 million worth of rates relief provided to nearly 1,000 businesses, nearly £22 million worth of business supports grants were awarded to local businesses. And I know the council was highlighted as one of the best in terms of the fastest to issue those grants to the local businesses, which clearly was really important and helpful to them to keep their businesses running effectively.
Tom, I've got a quick question around that. Some of that, we get the money back from the government. Do you know what the shortfall is that we've now got as a hole in our budget, or is that something that will come out elsewhere? I think that's being covered as effectively the third report on the agenda for tonight. I think Sue's probably going to provide an overview of where does this put the council financially as a result of COVID. All of this money effectively did come through national government in terms of grants, but we had to have our processes in place to administer and deliver this funding to those businesses that were due to receive it. So there's a huge amount of work that went on in the background in the finance team to make sure that this was quickly administered to those businesses that needed the support. But I think Sue will probably come in and talk to that issue in the final report for tonight's committee. Okay, thank you. Wait till then.
Sorry, Councillor Frankham, can I just pick that up? So just on the very specific question, we as the council did not return any of the funding. We fully distributed it all.
It's just that, was there any shortfall? But I'll wait till later to get that question.
Yes, no shortfall, but nothing returned.
Okay, excellent.
Brilliant. So they obviously, I won't go through all of these in detail. I was going to just skip a few slides because one of the key things was about the support we provided to residents, and this particular slide does include clearly the the council tax payment holiday, which was brought forward. All of the council tax bills for all our residents were reissued, and we brought that payment holiday forward to cover April and May, recognising that residents potentially would be in immediate need of financial support, and an action and a decision that was made by Cabinet early on to support residents. And we're one of very few authorities that I'm aware of nationally that did this. But it was again something that the council did to support residents across the borough. We also use that as an opportunity to send information to all the residents. So as part of the reissued bills that went out, we sent out information regarding the community hubs and the community helpline and how to access that support if residents needed it. So that there was a benefit in terms of us issuing those letters at that particular time as well. So that was in terms of the business and economic and welfare support team effectively and the work stream. And then the work supporting the vulnerable, this was led by the Executive Director for Borough Development. And the key aims of this, it's very simple on the slides, but it was around coordinating the council's response to support the community, particularly through the creation of the community hubs, and obviously working in partnership again through the LRF, learning from other authorities, picking up best practice, and supporting the voluntary sector. Obviously, as part of this, 28 community hubs were set up during the course of the response, and this sort of just reflected the amount of officer time that had been invested in supporting that work. There were 1,700 referrals for support through to to us as a local authority to support residents, and particular arrangements put in place with our partners in terms of BVS and other voluntary sector organisations to coordinate that response. As the leader has mentioned, there was a huge groundswell of volunteers that came forward very early on, which is really incredible. And as I say, this was really a positive thing to sort of put in place the arrangements through the voluntary sector to support our most vulnerable residents during this time of lockdown. So that's some of the key highlights just on that one. Sorry, the last group here in terms of just mentioning was the Pandemic Management Response Team. And this is really a group that's looking at all the council's routine activity and services. We were tracking staff absences, if you like, on a daily basis. So we do a daily sit rep every morning across all service areas, identifying staff that might be on absence due to leave or actually because they're having to self-isolate or whatever the circumstance may be, but obviously understanding where there might be impacts on our frontline services and therefore being able to quickly react to that and prioritise where needed. These are some of the sort of activities that were delivered and supported. So obviously we've gone from at scratch effectively to setting up a whole new system for creating these sorts of meetings, the virtual committee meetings. Huge amount of work that's gone in through our IT service to facilitate this at speed, and that's obviously allowed a lot of our all of our committees to continue the essential work that they do, but the DC committee and others. DC was the first, so just comes to mind. In terms of making sure that the council's core business and decisions can be made by elected representatives through the committee process. So virtual committee meetings were set up and put in place. A huge amount of work also went into supporting staff to be able to work from home effectively. An awful lot of new IT equipment has been purchased during the response period, and staff have been able to work effectively from home. Obviously, a lot of staff still are on the district, particularly in terms of our operations service and CSPOs, etc. And again, a huge amount of work has gone in to making sure that they can operate in a COVID secure way to reduce the risk of picking up the infection from anyone else or spreading it to other colleagues. So risk assessments, personal protective equipment, all kinds of measures have been put in place certain teams working in bubbles, again, just to protect them and to protect the services that they are there to provide. So again, a huge amount of work has gone on in the background to support staff and the services we provide. Again, I won't go into a lot of the details, but again, you can see from this that again, the routine activities were being undertaken and are being undertaken. So grass cutting, street sweeping, litter picking, etc. All these sort of core activities that the council would normally provide are being delivered. And again, another slide showing some of the core activities of the council. Obviously, all of our parks were open throughout COVID and obviously proved to be enormously important to a lot of residents who were using them for their daily exercise, etc. And those facilities were clearly kept open and for their general use. So that was what I was going to update on at that point. I don't know if there's any points of clarification before I hand over to Di.
Councillor Nick Robinson's hand up was first. So
yeah, okay. Thank you, Chair. Thanks very much, Tom. Could you send us a copy of all the slides? Could you email us a copy?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
It'll be really helpful. Thanks very much. Thank you.
We were emailed them earlier, but I'll make sure you get a copy if you haven't, because you're a substitution, so you might not have got it. Anybody else got any questions? Councillor David George.
Thank you very much indeed. Tom, look, basically, congratulations you and your team on a job very well done. I think, it's been very tough, and in general, I think things have gone very well. But I just wanted to raise a couple of relatively minor things, but it did cause some concern. I think the first one was, I think it's recognition that there's parts of our borough here that don't fit into the Basingstoke town norm. I think the most glaring one was the advice issued about basically what you do if you've got or suspect COVID and what have you. Now that applied to Northants CCG, but it didn't apply to parts of the western part of the borough, which is in a totally different CCG and has different guidance. And unfortunately, it caused a lot of confusion at the time because that was issued to places like Whitchurch, which it didn't apply to, and without any recognition of that or warning. So can I ask you just to recognise that? And there's the second things, is things like when advice was given on waste sites and things like that. Again, people close to Andover tend to use those waste sites. It would have been very good to have links to those sorts of facilities and sports facilities there. It was a little, should we say, Basingstoke centric, frankly, for some of the people living on more outskirts. So could I just ask you to recognise that? And if we do go through, particularly I think on the CCG issue, that was quite a difficult one, caused a lot of confusion at the time. Can I just ask you to recognise that? Thank you.
Okay. Tom, have you got anything to comment to that?
No, I'm more than happy to. I'll probably speak to you perhaps tomorrow. I'll contact you to talk through that in a bit more detail to get a better understanding of the confusion that may have occurred in terms of residents, the messages to residents in your ward particularly. But more than happy to pick that up with you.
Right, please do, Tom. Yeah.
Excellent. I've got a number of speakers. Councillor Kim Taylor was next on my list.
Okay.
Kim, you need to turn your mic on.
Right, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Sorry, I've got a few IT problems here. Yeah, just one question, sort of going back to sort of the supporting businesses really in connection with advice about being a COVID secure employer, and the what kind of role were we playing in that? And in particular, there was one point there was quite a lot of government announcements about how local authorities were going to be enforcing employers being COVID secure. So I just wondered what we were doing about enforcing, advising, and B, were we spot checking, because the claims were that the local authorities would be spot checking, and whether or not we had anything in the communications strategy that would enable residents to know who to contact if their employer was perhaps not operating in a COVID secure manner.
There are further slides later in the presentation which touch on, and I'll cover, if that's okay, I'll cover that point a bit later on. You're quite right to point out a lot of the work that's been going on to support businesses to safely reopen, and there's been a huge amount of work, it's fair to say, to do that. But yeah, I'll cover that with the latter slide, if that's okay.
Councillor Kerry Carruthers was next on my list. She had a question.
Hi, thank you, Councillor Frankham. Couple of things. First of all, I wanted to thank everybody involved with the updates to members, because they were invaluable for keeping us up to date, but also passing on information to residents. So thank you. I was particularly pleased to see the slide on delivering vital services. I think officers have done an absolutely incredible job under really difficult circumstances, and I'd just like to pass on my congratulations to them for their efforts. And a question, we talk about, there was a slide about the local businesses, and it's great that we administered so much support to local businesses. Obviously, that wasn't an unlimited amount of money, and that's now all gone. But what I'm wondering is, how did we communicate with local businesses to tell them that those grants were available? Did we do some work there, or was that done more widely?
Yeah, Daniel is in the wings, as it were. So what we may do, I mean, what I was keen to do is, if there's points of clarification on some of the slides that we've just covered, then perhaps we cover that now, but perhaps the more broader questions, perhaps we cover at the end of the presentation, if that would be slightly better. But yeah, more than happy if we make a note of that one as well, Councillor Carruthers, and we'll come back to that if that's okay at the end of the presentation.
That's fine, thank you.
Okay, and then final person to indicate I've noticed is Councillor McCormack. Would you like to ask a question?
I'm quite happy to wait till the end, Chair.
Okay, we wait to the end. Okay, who's the next speaker, please? Tom, who's been passed on to?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, I'll hand over to Di Bromley to take you through the next few slides.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Tom, and good evening, members. The next 3 slides show the timeline and decisions and actions taken. We've got national events and milestones given for context, but with the focus on the Council's actions and decisions for tonight. The first slide shows the initial phase of response from January to March, and it was the 31st of January that the first cases of COVID-19 were reported in the UK. The Council was monitoring developments, looking at our pandemic flu plan, as Tom said, and activated the plan on the 28th of February. This was in advance of the first reported case of COVID in Hampshire on the 3rd of March. In fact, the pandemic management team met on the 4th of March, and by the 6th of March, we'd already set up web pages on the Council's website, so setting up communications mechanisms to go forward. So by the point the World Health Organization declared a pandemic, and by the time the local LRF declared a major emergency, the Council was already stood up and ready to take action and thinking through what actions we might need to take. The week of the 16th of March was critical week. This was the week leading into the lockdown. If you remember, it was announced that schools and colleges and early years would close from the 20th of March. And it was also announced that entertainment and hospitality and leisure would also close from the 20th of March. And so the 23rd of March was the first full week in lockdown. I think the timeline shows that the breadth and the scale of the council's response is already starting to show, and the partnership working that has been a key feature of our response. Even at that early stage, we were building our business advice to support the humanitarian and community support response. The BVA Community Network was created. This was a partnership to coordinate and enhance support to individuals and communities across the borough. And we were also responding to announcements and the impact on the council as well. Next slide. The next slide shows how intense the activity was. In April, by the second week, we have additional funding announced for council tax support. And as Tom mentioned, the payment-free months in April and May. That was also announced at the end of March, beginning of April. Business rate reliefs were set up, and the business rates grants planned for and made available. That was from the 7th of April. The work to offer people safe accommodation so they could come in from the streets, that was coordinated with the Social Inclusion Partnership. And the shielding programme, our staff and our partners working together. The support for council's commercial tenants, that began in March, April, and funding for BVA, the 200,000 from the council. And where services had to change due to health and safety, this was also widely communicated. So by the time we get to the 6th or the 7th of April, which is only 2 to 3 weeks since the lockdown, we were already delivering significant pieces of work at scale and at pace. And then there was the legislation that was coming through at that time that required a technical response, most notably the virtual meetings regulations that came through at the beginning of April, and also the legislation needed for COVID response in the Coronavirus Act. I should say that this timeline only deals with the major actions. As Thomas said, we were acting every day. The work of the community hub, that was also at weekends. So a huge amount of work has gone into this. What you see on the timeline is just key milestones. 14th of April, the lockdown was extended for a further 3 weeks. And then on the 10th and 11th of May, the alert levels were introduced and the roadmap was published, which laid the ground for what was going to happen next and when. And then the final slide. The next phase to July starts with the roadmap. Okay. Starts with the roadmap in May. It shows facilities gradually reopening and the other work streams taking place, including the small business grant scheme that was launched on the 26th of May. That was for small and micro businesses. Virtual committee and council meetings taking place. A huge partnership effort to gradually reopen the town centre and the district centres around the borough, particularly from the 15th of June when non-essential retail opened. And then the support to businesses continued. This is through the economic development team, but also, as we've mentioned, the support to businesses helping with the COVID secure guidelines that came in May. We've taken the timeline up to the 4th of July, so it's the first 3 to 4 months, the first phase of our response overall. Clearly, there have been further actions since, and there are further actions going on. But just to hand over to Sally Boxall to bring you up to date with the data, the latest data and what the latest position is for Basingstoke-Deane.
Thank you, Di. Good evening. If Tom wants to move on, thank you. So I'm going to talk through the local data on confirmed cases and deaths within the borough and surrounding area. So firstly, apologies for the earlier version of this slide that was circulated, as it didn't show the data very clearly, but hopefully this one does. So the chart shows the number of confirmed cases of COVID-19 by week in Basingstoke-Deane in the blue area, in Hampshire County with the red area, and in Hampshire, including the cities of Portsmouth, Southampton, and also the Isle of Wight in grey. This data is published daily by Public Health England, and it is administrative data, and it is subject to revision over subsequent days as more data becomes available. So for each week of the year, this chart shows the confirmed cases for residents living in these areas that have been tested under Pillar 1, which is swab testing in Public Health England labs and NHS hospitals, for those with a clinical need and also those working in the health and care sector. The data also includes Pillar 2 testing, which is the wider swab testing of the general population. So in total, up to the point when this data was taken, there have been 995 confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Basingstoke and Deane. And cases peaked in early April with 165 cases a week. Research from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine suggests that nationally there may have been 100,000 cases a week during during the peak. And so these early levels of cases are likely to be a considerable underestimate because there wasn't wide-scale testing. So the latest week of data shown on the chart is from the 7th to the 13th of September. And we've cut the data here because of those more recent days being subject to revision and changes. So at the time this data was taken, and in that week, there were 9 confirmed cases of coronavirus in Basingstoke and Deane, compared with 12 the week before. And across Hampshire County overall, there are 114 cases. And if you include the cities and the Isle of Wight, 172 cases. The most recent data, which is not on this slide, and again will be subject to revision because it's for the most recent days. So from the 14th to the 20th of September, it's showing as 8 confirmed cases in the borough, but that might change. So next slide, please, Tom. Thank you. So this chart converts those cases into cases per 100,000 residents. So those 9 cases in Basingstoke and Deane translate into a case rate of 5.1 confirmed cases per 100,000 people between the 7th and 13th of September. And this compares to an average for Hampshire County of 8.2 and an overall England average of 33.3. Next slide, please. And then to put those figures into perspective, this chart compares those Hampshire and Basingstoke and Deane level figures with the areas on the government's watch list of areas that need intervention. So the watch list or the areas included here were created using data from the 28th of August to the 3rd of September. But the data that I've shown here is again that comparable week from the 7th to the 13th of September. So in this data, Bolton has a confirmed case rate of 210.7 cases per 100,000 people, which is significantly higher than any of the other areas on the list, and significantly higher than the Hampshire figures. And in many cases, the majority of areas on that list have figures more than 10 times the figure for Basingstoke and Deane. This surveillance report is published on a Friday, so you might be aware from the news that there were additional areas added last Friday, but they were too late to include in these slides. So this data evolves on a weekly basis. Next slide, please. So moving on to look at the deaths data, and this is weekly figures on deaths that are reported by the Office for National Statistics. And so they are provisional counts of the number of deaths registered. This is deaths where COVID-19 is mentioned on the death certificate. The Basingstoke and Deane data is for residents that live in the borough, and then the Hampshire data is for residents of Hampshire. And this chart includes deaths that occurred up to the 4th of September 2020, but were registered up until the 12th of September. So sadly, in Basingstoke and Deane, there have been 117 deaths with COVID-19 mentioned on the death certificate, and deaths in Basingstoke and Deane peaked during the week ending the 10th of April, where there were 20 deaths that week. Deaths in Hampshire County peaked a week later in the week ending the 17th of April. There have been no deaths with COVID-19 mentioned on the death certificate in Basingstoke and Deane since the 26th of June. And new data published today up until the 11th of September also confirms that. So there has been an additional death within the county, but not within the borough during that last week. Next slide, please, Tom. So this slide converts those figures on the number of deaths into a crude death rate to show the deaths per 100,000 people in each area. Calculated using those figures from the Office for National Statistics and also the Office for National Statistics data on total populations. This comparison is crude and very basic, because obviously each of these areas has different age structure, different population groups, and each individual with areas has their own different risk level for the virus. And so there could be many kind of wider and individual factors that would contribute to the level of deaths. In Hampshire County overall, there have been 77 deaths per 100,000 people, whilst Basingstoke and Deane saw 66.3. And Test Valley has seen the largest number of deaths per 100,000 people, whilst the lowest figure in Portsmouth has been about half the figure seen in Test Valley. So those are all of the slides on cases and deaths in the borough.
Thank you, Sally. If it's okay, I'll move on to the lessons identified. Obviously, this is as mentioned before, a global pandemic, and we have had to respond very quickly to new information and evidence around how to control the spread of the virus and what action to take to support communities and support businesses as well. So our response structure has been responsive, as I say, meeting daily, for example, and responding very quickly to new policy advice and directions from government to put in place the appropriate measures to support our communities. Obviously, things we could not control at the time when this outbreak first effectively got started across the UK was the issues around PPE shortages, which were obviously a big concern at that time. And you know, where we are now is in a far better place. So across the local resilience forum area, there is a strategic stockpile that is available should there be any issues in terms of normal sort of supply chains for example, care homes across the county. That there is that contingency now in place to support those sorts of settings if required. But also across us as a local authority, we again have our PPE arrangements in place to make sure that staff have the adequate protection that they need to carry out their jobs. You know, we are constantly monitoring the data and looking at the trends to ensure that we are able to respond appropriately. One of the key things we've learned has demonstrated the importance of really is the partnership working that is, you know, hugely important in terms of delivering a response to something of this magnitude. You know, we're obviously extremely grateful to partners in the voluntary sector, but also obviously key partners in other organisations for the support that's been provided to support our communities effectively during this pandemic. And then lastly, obviously test and trace. Again, we were one of the first few authorities to provide sites for local testing, mobile test, drive-through test centre, if you like. And again, just recognising that the huge importance of that, so residents can get a test locally and obviously take appropriate action to self-isolate, etc., with that information. So again, we're just supporting in terms of providing sites for that testing. Lessons learned, again, it's extremely fast-paced and often working with uncertainty at that time. And obviously key announcements were made and guidance sometimes was come out after the key announcements. And we obviously had to act very, very quickly to provide clarity and advice to our communities in terms of how we were going to respond locally. So the speed at which we reacted was crucial, and the structures that we put in place were effective in ensuring we could do that. I've mentioned already in terms of some of the support there. Obviously, we worked very, very closely with the BID and town centre in terms of shopping centres in terms of their safe reopening, obviously a point of clarity that was mentioned earlier, in terms of all the work that went into the 15th of June, I think it was, with the reopening of non-essential retail, putting in place appropriate signage throughout the town centre and such like. So it's, again, the partnership working with our key partners was really crucial. This is kind of sort of moving forward effectively. So there's the government framework, the contained framework, which again outlines the government's response and how we unlocked ourselves from lockdown, which is obviously crucial. And of course, obviously, the key thing that's happened since then is the formation of the local outbreak control plans, which are controlled through Hampshire County Council. They are the responsible authority for developing the Hampshire Outbreak Control Plan, monitoring the incidence of COVID across the whole county. A lot of work has been done to identify vulnerable people within our areas at a very local level, so that we have the best possible information to respond should there be outbreaks across the borough. As I mentioned, PPE is in a much better place now in terms of the availability of PPE and also in terms of our sort of stockpiling of that of those equipment. So that I will just move forward, conscious of time. So we are in a good place. We clearly have learned lessons as we've moved through the response to this pandemic. The community organisations are still active and are ready to respond in the event of an increase in cases locally and an increase in demand for support from residents. As Sally's mentioned, infection rates currently are very low in comparison to other areas of the country. However, that could change quickly, and obviously we need to respond and to monitor that very, very closely. Our response structure is still in place. We are still meeting very regularly to respond to and to look at the emerging policies from government and to make sure that we plan and respond effectively. Obviously, again, we are working very closely with all of our partners across the Hampshire and Isle of Wight area, and I think I will stop the presentation at that point and open this out to questions.
Okay, we'll kick in with the first questions that we're going to answer later on. So, Kim, have your questions been answered, or are you still got anything further to ask?
I think really the question regarding what we've been doing specifically in terms of advising employers, and in particular in terms of enforcement of secure COVID employment, and making sure that residents know who to contact if they feel they are not in secure employment. I mean, that still does need a little bit of flesh on the bones with that, I think. And I think the only other question I've got really is about on the timescales in connection with our responses for homelessness. Because on the timescales, it looks like we took an awfully long time from when we started an initiative to when we found them accommodation, from the 25th of March to the 7th of May. And I'm sure that's not actually what happened. I'm sure there must have been more things going on in that time. So that perhaps that doesn't look quite as reflect actually the current situation. So I am keen to know about employment, because I do get contacts from residents who are very concerned about their places of employment, and I'm not sure that we've let residents know about our role, if we actually have one, and actually what we have been doing. So that really it's those two things that I'm sort of interested in really at this point.
Apologies. So in terms of the business, the advice to businesses, clearly we have communicated through our established sort of channels, through the economic team to all the businesses in the borough, what the key advice is to them for their particular sector in terms of operating in a COVID secure way. So there's obviously specific advice and specific guidance documents targeting those particular businesses, depending on what sector they're in. So that advice has been shared through those channels. We also, again, for example, in the lead up to the 15th of June, we also had officers going door to door through the town to, again, make sure that particularly the smaller businesses who don't have the sort of support structure of a larger organisation were clear about what sort of measures they should be putting in place to protect themselves and to protect the public. So again, there was that support that was offered. Again, working through the bid as well to make sure that we were sharing the messages as effectively as we could with all the businesses in the borough. In answer to the question around enforcement, yes, our environmental health team particularly, but also a licensing team have a role to play with that in ensuring and making sure businesses do comply with the requirements. And there has been an awful lot of inquiries that have come through to the team, but particularly from businesses, in all honesty, in terms of saying, you know, are we interpreting this correctly? This is how we believe we should be operating. What's your advice? And so we're providing an awful lot of support to the businesses directly who are contacting us for that type of advice. But we have also responded to complaints effectively from, it's usually from not necessarily the people within the businesses themselves, but usually from members of the public who may raise concerns that perhaps the practices in one business are different to another one, and is that appropriate, etc. So again, you know, there's been an awful lot of advice that's been given. We do have effectively at the end of the day an enforcement role to play if that was required, but I'm very pleased to say that businesses have responded where we have given advice positively to that advice to ensure that they are doing the right things. Clearly, if there are concerns for particular constituents that have raised issues, more than happy, please either direct them to me and I can make sure that they are followed up. But again, they can be sent to the council through our contact centre and they'll then reach the relevant team to follow up. In terms of the other question you had, is that? Yeah, sorry, housing. I might hand over to Di if that's okay to pick up on the support provided to the homeless.
Thank you, Tom. I think that might be something that Kate's team might want to reflect on and respond to once her agenda item is on. Looking at the timeline, it may be a bit misleading. The 7th of May date was the announcement that it had been done. So it wasn't necessarily a milestone saying this is the last point that the homeless people have secured accommodation. This was a roundup announcement to say that the council had been working in partnership with key partners and that the process had now worked through that all the accommodation had been secured. So if it looks like it only happened by the 7th of May, that's a bit misleading. I apologise for that. It was an announcement at the end of the process to say what had happened and all of the partners who'd been involved with it. But it doesn't mean that the response took until the 7th of May to carry out. The work started way back in March, as the timeline shows. That by the 25th of March, the process is already underway to find safe and secure accommodation for rough sleepers. But Kate may be able to expand on that later on in the agenda.
Yeah, I think we'll leave that for when Kate does an agenda item later for that. I've got a number of other speakers. I will comment at this point. A number of people I pointed towards licensing for advice. We're all very satisfied and very happy with the advice they got. They did a really good sterling job, and as they always do, the licensing team with advice for people that need it around that subject. Okay, I've got Councillor Carruthers, Councillor McCormack, Councillor Harvin, Councillor George really wanting to speak. So if any of us, if you indicate, I'll add you to the list. But Councillor Carruthers would like to ask a question she asked earlier.
Hi. Yeah, my question earlier was really just to ask what we did to communicate with businesses to let them know about the various different grants that were available. I know I knew a couple of people locally that had small businesses that seemed very confused about whether or not they were entitled to anything. It was particularly confusing, I think, at the time, and I just wondered whether we as a council did any work on that, in terms of were we approaching businesses or were we waiting for them to come to us?
Yeah, I might hand over to Daniel at this point, who can talk to that, respond to that question, if that's okay.
Sure. Good evening, members. So, Councillor Coolers, I think we did a range of things really. It was both reactive and proactive. As you you seem to remember, there was a lot of guidance, or a lot of announcement coming out of government, but the guidance always took probably a week to follow, which I think led to some confusion for businesses because they weren't quite sure what they were supposed to do, where to get the guidance. So our key role really was very much to make sure that the information, that businesses knew where to find information. So we did this through various ways. We published emailers on a regular basis with the latest guidance, where to find it and what to do. We also convened a group with the Chamber of Commerce, the FSP, the LEP and the BID to make sure that our information was coordinated and that we sharing the same messages to our businesses. We basically answered direct inquiries. I think we got over 500 inquiries in our business inbox. So very much the one-to-one type of contact and advice to businesses. We also worked with business associations in Whitchurch and Overton, for example, supporting them. We had a meeting with businesses in Whitchurch, telling them what the guidance was, what to do. We also used our InQ Hive Enterprise Hub in the town centre to provide that direct business support as well. We had some FAQs on our website. And we also did some direct surgeries. So we actually sat down with businesses, particularly around the town centre reopening, so that they knew what to do, how to operate safely. So it was really a range of measures. So it was both proactive in terms of sharing the information and communication, but also I think responding to direct inquiries, and I think working closely with our business rates team on the grants front. But I can appreciate that there was some confusion because at points, we were also confused ourselves, what was the process and the guidance.
Does that answer your question, Councillor Groves?
Yeah, that was really helpful. Thank you very much.
Okay, Councillor McCormack, I've got you next.
Thank you, Chair. I'll just reiterate the thanks already given to Tom, Diane, Rebecca, all the people in your departments for a tremendous job well done in gathering all this information and presenting it in a readily digestible format. A huge amount of work has been undertaken these last 6 months. It's been a challenge like no other that this council has had. The only thing that might compare to it was the civic emergency that never happened in the 80s with nuclear war. Thankfully, we didn't have that one, but this has been really challenging, and a lot of our residents have been ill or lost their lives. I had a question on the testing. We had a testing facility at West Ham, and it got set up, and then it was barely used, and then it got dismantled again. It all seemed to be done over the heads of local agencies. Can we have any light shed on why it was set up and then taken down so quickly when we had a shortage of testing, and what lessons we might learn from that and what we might input to the government? Because what's become apparent is that while test, track and trace is not without its problems, where we've had the greater successes, it's been with effective local schemes instead of having a Westminster scheme.
Of course, yeah. So when you mentioned the West Ham site, can I just ask, is that the leisure park you're referring to?
The leisure park, yes.
Yeah. Right, okay. So we are effectively as a council supporting that site. It still operates. There are 3 mobile testing units that operate across Hampshire, and I believe there are 9 sites that they use across Hampshire. to do the testing. So they're not there every day of the week. Typically, they're there 3 days a week, and that is still available to them and still, as I understand it, ongoing. So they still use that site and they still use the site at Viables as well. But yeah, it's those mobile test units, and they are the 2 sites across in the borough as we speak. There is also work ongoing at the moment because we were asked to suggest sites that could be used for a walk-in test location, so not reliant solely on having a motor vehicle and getting to a mobile testing site. And we have put forward some suggestions working with particular businesses in our borough where we think that could be provided. So that's gone back through the LRF to colleagues in health to look at those particular sites as possible venues for walk-in testing as well.
Does that answer your questions then, Councillor Cormack?
Yeah, he answered my supplemental as well, actually, which was about the walk-in centres.
Okay, excellent. Councillor Harvey is next on the list.
Thank you, Chair. Can I echo everyone else's comments about the hard work of all the council, really, and thank all the officers, it's the whole council for what they've done and the effort that's been put in for a long time. I mean, the tremendous consistency and effort put in over such a long time. Thank you. I mean, it's not over, and we've got months ahead of us, and your efforts will be tremendous, I know, over the coming months, let alone what you've already done. So huge thank you. And thank you for the comprehensive report. I mean, the level of data and the level of information is incredibly helpful and informative to anybody watching tonight of the efforts that the council's gone to. 3 quick questions, if I can. Could I ask about data sharing? I'm conscious of examples in other places of where from county to borough to agency, largely because of GDPR, largely because of information barriers you would naturally have in those agencies, it's not necessarily easy to share data, particularly of those most vulnerable. And how we overcome that and manage that, I think, is important. And is that one of your lessons learned about how we might better do that, particularly for some of the most vulnerable in our community? And I'm conscious of a couple of cases where, I don't want to say people fell between the gaps, but it was a question of whose list were they on, to which support they got, and how they got their support. And that was more of the difficulty. Second question around food bank needs then falls out of that. There's existing need still now. I mean, people who previously got support from the food bank who are at the moment not getting support because the situation has changed, but nonetheless, they're still vulnerable. They're still nervous of going out. They're still concerned about going out. They're not shielding at the moment, but they're not quite sure what they do, if they should or they shouldn't. And of course, the advice is changing today. So how do we go on about perhaps assessing vulnerability of those particular people who are close to being, as it were, in need? And then in the resilience of the testing bit that Andy's just raised, really, we've got a couple of examples of people having to go out to Salisbury to get tests. Just how much are we in control of that? Do we have any influence at all over how we might be able to help that local situation for our own residents? Or are we totally dependent upon what the national kind of shape of that test and trace element is, particularly for local people wanting or needing to get tested because they qualify, because they feel they have symptoms? Thank you, Chair.
Yes, of course. So just to take these in reverse order, if I can. So in terms of testing, it is controlled nationally through the Department of Health and Social Care. Clearly, we have raised concerns in terms of the availability of testing locally. The government, obviously the picture that's been put across nationally in terms of the increase in demand, the government have had to respond to, and now how they prioritise those available tests. Again, that's been shared more widely. So I'm just looking for my. Okay. So obviously, in terms of support to acute clinical care being the #1 priority, supporting to people in care homes, NHS staff, GPs, and pharmacies. To tackle outbreaks, and the 5th priority group in terms of teaching staff with symptoms. And then finally, you know, the general public. So there's a priority list to how they are managing the available tests that are currently available. I know through the Local Resilience Forum, but across the whole of the South East, wrote to government several weeks ago now to highlight concerns, to say that this is hugely important to us. It's really important for residents and for our workers to be able to get a test quickly to clarify whether they have COVID or not, and the impact that could otherwise have on frontline services and to our residents. And also all the council leaders across Hampshire also wrote to governments as well. Again, this is probably about a week to 10 days ago at least, again, raising those particular issues. So we know nationally the government are responding to this. New facilities are coming online regularly to increase the capacity for the analysis of those tests. And so we do expect that that issue will improve over time. That's probably as much information I can give. We don't control it locally. Is really the answer. You know, the only thing we can really control is making sure there are sites that people can get those tests, and that's where our role comes in. I might hand over to Daniel, possibly on the issues around how we support vulnerable people in our community.
Sure, no problem. So, Councillor Harvey, I think the community hub sort of element, it's still there, so it hasn't kind of stopped or stood down. So, obviously, working quite closely with the food bank and CAB at the moment. The food bank focus is very much on hardship, so people kind of facing challenges with affording food, but support for people that are kind of shielding or not able kind of to go shopping or access supermarket slot is still there. So I think the best thing I would say is kind of if you've come across any cases, kind of refer them back to the Hampshire helpline, because the Hampshire helpline is still there, still operating, and basically they do the first triage, and then that basically will be referred back down to us. But I think, you know, the likes of Spotlight and Inspero and Overton Cares and I think Viables, you know, kind of some of the community hubs are still operating, so that support is still out there, and that hasn't changed. I think it's just kind of the difference now at the moment with kind of the people actually kind of issues because of COVID related issues and hardship issues, which basically are dealt differently by different organizations.
I think probably the other point I didn't really pick up on was around the availability of data.
Just the data sharing piece, Tom, between us, the county, and for example, the NHS. I'm conscious of a couple of cases where people, as I say, they didn't fall through the gaps, but it was confusion about which of who was picking them up to support them because of the protection over data, the data issue, because whose list were they on? County's list if they were on social services, was it on the NHS list, or was it on our perhaps lists? And that data sharing element could be quite important going forward as a lesson learned, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, and again, other colleagues may wish to sort of add to this, but you know, clearly, if you are as a ward councillors, you'll be aware of particular individuals or get information from residents that might highlight a particular concern. Then make sure, I think as Daniel's mentioned, it's really important that we direct people through the Hampshire helpline in the first instance, which is operating through to the end of March currently. And obviously our arrangements locally are in place and ready to provide additional support if that's required over the coming months. You know, the information sharing, obviously we've got to be careful with what we do with the data, but you know, in the context of an emergency response, you know, the key partners and key organisations can share information to make sure that vulnerable people in our communities are receiving the support that they need. But you know, clearly that is a concern, and you know, I think if you've got particular cases or instances that you're concerned about, then please either direct them through the community through the Hampshire helpline, or again come through to us directly, and we can make sure that support is provided.
Does Kate have anything to add to that?
Yeah, sure. Just in terms of what we were sharing sector-wise, there was a lot of non-personalised data that was being shared in order to track trends, and to also back to MHCLG, was keeping close sort of tabs on the direction of travel. In terms of the most vulnerable cases at a local level, because of the mean partnership being already in place, the information sharing protocols were already there and quite robust. I think picking up on your point, in some respects, there was so much support going into the vulnerable cases. So you might have, if you look at a rough sleeper, you might have outreach, you might have some of the health providers, the housing associations, and the housing workers and the resettlement workers. So to some extent, yes, there was an inundation of support in many respects, which is probably preferable to being no support, but there's always opportunities to sort of streamline some of that.
One thing I noted, Kate, was it depended perhaps on when the case presented itself. So if the case presented itself late on a Friday afternoon and you were desperately trying to get help for somebody because they were facing something, County stepped up on a couple of occasions. Daniel was amazing. I mean, the team were absolutely amazing stepping up, and I thank them for it. But it was a question of who you could get hold of in that particular case on that time, going into a weekend environment, particularly some of the bank holidays, actually, when it was a question of, well, whose list is this person on? Do we know about them? There was a sense of getting hold of the information to better inform the response so that the right response was given, if you like, to the circumstances. That was my particular experience of the case. It wasn't anybody did anything wrong. It was more who could talk to who at that sort of circumstance in that emergency that seemed to be the issue, really, of whose data was being used at the time.
And given we're clearly not out of COVID yet, by all means, send me across the details of that case so we can always have a case reviewed, so we can look at processes and review.
But it was dealt with, and the team were brilliant. But it highlighted something, that was all. Thank you very much.
Councillor George is the last speaker I've got at the moment. So,
sorry, Councillor Frankham, can I just add something on the data sharing element?
Yes, if you please carry on.
I think I take your point about kind of the data sharing, but we've got protocols in place both between us and BV at the moment, kind of to share data for community support, but also we now have access to the vulnerable data from the NHS. So I think a limited number of officers basically can actually have access to the vulnerable and the potentially shielding. So I think that data element has improved significantly over time. I think there was always teething problems at the start, and I think you see many agencies doing some different things and confusion. But I think we've learned a lot along the way.
Excellent. Are you satisfied with that, Councillor Harvey? Okay. Councillor George, if you would like to ask your questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Chair. Very much, Tom, this is an issue I think which is recognised as a national one and not very much specific to Basingstoke and Dean, but I'd like to just explore it a little bit. Early on in the pandemic, we tried to get some help for some of our care homes in Whitchurch, and frankly, we found it wasn't over PPE or things like that. It was over temporary accommodation for staff so they wouldn't transmit disease to the care home and to their families, vice versa. To be honest with you, although David Byrne and Daniel tried to help as best they can, there was a marked reluctance to help them, frankly, and I think the sticking point, even though we contacted the military, they had places available, the sticking point and bottleneck seemed to be the Hampshire Isle of Wight Local Resilience Forum, and they wouldn't do anything without their say-so, and they weren't prepared to help early on. Can I, given we're all very thankful for the low incidence rate we have here at the moment, but in one way that's great, but in another way it does mean that some of these care homes may still be very vulnerable, given that there's probably little immunity there. Can I be assured, very frankly, that we have been in contact with the care homes in great detail now, because they still contain some of the most vulnerable people, and we are in a position to be able to help them with things like, such as I suggested, if they need it, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Councillor George. This is one of the key strands, if you like, of the local outbreak control plan across Hampshire. Clearly the vulnerability of residents in care homes, and obviously a lot of work and the framework for how they are supported through Hampshire County Council and the public health team is really set out in that overarching document. I think I know the particular instance that you're referring to because I recall this being raised during the response. And it seems like a very good idea, doesn't it, that staff who were prepared to effectively put themselves into separate accommodation from their families, just so they minimise the possible risk of picking up COVID and then bringing it into a care home. The advice that we had through the public health team at the time was that very much, provided they are following the public health advice in terms of washing their hands and all of the PPE that's required in that sort of setting, that was felt not to be required. But it's not to say it wasn't a good idea, and it did demonstrate just how the staff were prepared to go above and beyond, really, to protect all of their residents, which is really fantastic, and hats off to them for the lengths they went to. I think across the borough, I know the data is not presented tonight in terms of committee, but thankfully we did have actually a relatively low number of care homes affected with COVID compared to other areas. Again, I think just testament to the fact that lots of the care homes across our district were taking really robust action to protect their residents. But I do take on board what you're, the point that you've raised, and obviously we tried to provide the best advice we could based on public health advice at that time.
Can I just come back on that, because yes, and I understand that and what have you, but in the end, I think it was the local community that reacted to that, and they were in fact found to have temporary accommodation in a local church rooms, and we did a full risk assessment with the help, I think, of Daniel and David and his team, frankly, and we were able to give that extra level of protection, which I think was very, very much to the benefit of the community in our care homes.
Again, we are we'll try to support where we can, and it's a fantastic thing that they obviously did to support the residents. So I'll take that point on board, and clearly, if similar requests come forward, I take on board the point that you've made that we should support that as much as possible to help protect residents.
Right, that's everyone that's asked the question. Anybody else got any other questions before? Okay, this report's to be noted. I'm not quite sure how to do this, but I'd like to have some sort of motion to thank the staff for their fantastic work during this first phase of the crisis, and with the partnership working. If someone can second something around that. Is it Andy McCormack? Is that all agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed. So although it's meant to be noted, there's a motion to say thank you to all the staff and all the partners for the fantastic work during this first phase, and keep it up. And thank you for your time tonight. Okay. On to item 6, the housing allocation. All right, all the members are now back in as Councillor Bristol Robinson. Do you want to continue?
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you, members, for your time this evening. This item before you is the annual review of the housing allocations policy, which comes to Scrutiny Committee at this time every year as an annual review of how the council's been keeping up with affordable housing delivery and how those have been allocated to the most vulnerable residents in our borough. Helping provide opportunities for residents at all stages in life is a key priority for the council. The housing allocations policy forms the basis of ensuring we help those most in need access safe and secure accommodation. Over the last year, the council oversaw delivery of 494 affordable homes, building on the delivery of 414 affordable homes in the previous year, both of which are well in excess of the 300 target. The continued increase in supply means that the yearly lettings have risen by 16%, which is 10% higher than the increase of the size of the housing register at 6%. So that's meant that the supply of new and re-let affordable homes has kept pace with the increase in demand for the second consecutive year, which is good news. This helps applicants reduce waiting times for residents looking to find a property. And I'm pleased to see in particular that there is a reduction in the number of families with children on the register, leading to reduced waiting times. Increasingly, there are large numbers of all properties advertised are at social rent levels, including newly delivered properties. However, the greatest area of need continues to be for single occupancy, and we do have a need for well-run HMOs for single people to ensure that we can provide accommodation options for everyone. Clearly, the housing team is mindful of the current health pandemic, and listening to the conversation that members had on the previous item, the housing team have been working incredibly hard throughout the crisis, and I would like to thank them for their work publicly now. We know that this will have an impact on this report next year. The report before you is on the housing allocations for the last year, so I don't want to dwell on COVID too much, but we are aware that this will change for next year. We have an all-member briefing booked in the next few weeks, where we'll be able to talk through with all members how the housing allocations and how housing services have been running under COVID. But just as a headline, the council has provided advice and assistance to over 750 households who are facing potential homelessness through COVID. Through advice and assistance to those individuals, in around 85–90% of cases, that advice and assistance meant that that person or those people were able to stay in the accommodation they were in, which is great news. And for the remainder, we have directly accommodated 86 households through emergency accommodation. There have been some people who've been placed in B&B. There have been some accommodation offers which have been provided by registered social landlords such as Vivid. And that's been really helpful because we've been able to cater for people. Anybody who wanted to find safe and secure accommodation for the duration of lockdown and for the pandemic has been given that accommodation, and that offer of support continues now that we move out and potentially back into a second wave now. We're joined on the officer side by Kate and Sue, and I don't know whether Kate's got anything to add before we move over back to you, Chair, for members' questions. Kate?
I think you've covered everything. That was an excellent introduction. So no, Sue and I are here to pick up any technical questions that members may have.
Thank you.
Okay, is there any questions? Councillor Faulkner was first to indicate.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just on 3.2.1 in the report, in previous years, on occasion, we've had the odd problem between our allocations policy and the allocations policy of the registered providers.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just comment if that's gone okay in the last year, or have we had any issues?
Sorry, shall I answer?
Yes, Sue, if you want to. It's difficult not doing this.
Sorry,
in person,
apologies, I'm flipping between looking at the report. We haven't. I mean, housing associations have their own exclusion policies, but in the last year, we haven't had a cause to challenge any decision that they've made. And when they refuse people, they have to state their reasons for doing so. So we haven't had anything that would cause us concern to challenge them.
I think it's worth saying that we have a very good relationship, in particular with Vivid and Sovereign, who are the main providers in the borough. We have excellent relationships with them, and indeed with the other housing associations that are active. So usually we're working very closely in partnership with them, and we haven't experienced too many issues.
Does that answer all your questions, Councillor Faulkner?
Yeah, that's fine, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor George, you're next on my list.
Thank you, Chair. Tristan, this is obviously very, very, very welcome, the large number of additional places available and things like that. can I ask you, you've got a record number here of new availability this year. Is this, can I ask, is the planning policies of this council working very much in terms of delivering the affordable housing, i.e. what percentage of affordable housing are we actually producing as an overall stock, or is it coming from elsewhere? Is it actually the success of the 40% housing requirement and planning that's delivering this good news?
Thank you. I would certainly say that the high level of delivery that we've seen over the last couple of years has been a result of our high level of delivery of homes overall. So in the last couple of years, we've seen, so through the local plan, we have to deliver 850 homes a year. That's what our target is, and 40% of those are affordable, which gives us the target of 300. Over the last couple of years, we've been delivering way over and above the 850, so that's why we've seen the rise in affordable. We have been very successful at ensuring that developers deliver the 40%, and they also deliver that on site, which is something I'm really keen to see delivered. And I see Councillor Miller nodding as our chair of DC, but it's something that we have been successful in seeing, because one of my concerns is that when we have developers provide off-site contributions, that money can sit in a bank account, dare I say, and then it can be quite challenging to find schemes to spend that capital on. And we do have a range of schemes that we're spending that capital on. There's a scheme coming forward in the centre of town, which we've been passing through board members recently for their sign-off. So there are schemes that we're looking to, but broadly, yes, we have been successful in A, securing the 40%, and B, making sure that that is on the site, so that we make sure that we're pepper potting development, so that we're having affordable mixed in with private, and we're not creating two-tier societies from day one, which is really important.
Does that answer your questions?
Could I ask one supplementary there? Could I ask about rural exception schemes as well, and to what extent they're contributing to this?
I might have to defer to Kate or Sue, and it might be something that I'll look at them vaguely, and it might be something we have to pick up with planning colleagues. This is where we sort of stray into the boundary between housing and regulatory planning, so it might be something that we pick up with planning colleagues, but I don't know if Kate and Sue want to comment.
Yeah, I mean, to say that rural exception schemes have played a contribution, I think would be accurate. There have been successful schemes. Councillor Faulkner's had one in his ward, and I can't see all members on my screen. There are other members that that have had experience of rural exception schemes. They are there as a policy provision. They are extremely difficult to get off the ground and bring to fruition, but they are a part, nonetheless, of a bigger jigsaw. So they do have a part to play.
Is that helpful, or would you like a comment from? I can take that back to planning, Councillor George, and we can get a note from them if that would be helpful.
Well, it'd be very interesting to see how they are performing, but it's something we can take offline, I'm sure.
Sure, thank you.
I've got a number of speakers: Tilbury, Harvey, Caden, Carruthers. So if Ian Tilbury was the first of those to indicate, so he'd like to ask you questions.
Oh, thanks, Paul. Yeah. Basically, I just one for Kate and, well, everyone really, but section 2.8, it's got about the rural parish connections, and there's a rather startling statistic that of all the houses built in the rural areas, where there is a local connection usually, and normally, speaking from my own experience in Ovan, they nearly always go to local people. It's unusual for them to go somewhere else. We're now suggesting that 53% of those properties were let to households with a local connection. Well, of course, that means 47% weren't. And what we're seeing in Ovan is large developments with mainly flatted accommodation, which no one actually wants, is totally inappropriate for most people, particularly people with young children. It's 3-story blocks of flats for mothers, people, single people with children, totally inappropriate, and causes all sorts of other issues. So we're basically building the wrong houses in the wrong places here. If only we had a large chunk of land near Basingstoke where they could build all these houses, but apparently we seem to be struggling with that. But I mean, this is quite a recent phenomenon. I mean, I don't know if it's the same everywhere, but have we got no ability to sort of try and influence the builders to build something more appropriate, like 2-bedroom houses at least, that people may actually want to bid for, because I don't see much point keep building houses that people don't want to live in. Or and the other corollary, the thing that's causing me problems now is, for years, I mean, you'll know, Kate, I've always fought for more affordable housing and supported development in the villages for that reason. Certainly in my own, no, we're struggling. That people are saying, well, what's the point of building these houses? They're not being built for local need. And no, we've got the statistics to prove it. You know, this is quite worrying. I mean, it's the first time I've ever seen these sort of figures at this level. There was always the odd one or two where, you know, people didn't want them. There just happened to be no one bidding at that time. But when we're getting, you know, whole blocks of flats being filled up with people with no connection to the villages, we went down that road in the 1970s with, you know, certain areas in the village which became problem areas, and, you know, and they were tarred with that, and they still are now because of the problems we're getting there. We were then, you know, we're starting to get these sorts of problems coming back now, because you've got people who don't want to live in the place. They've got no connection with the village. You know, if they work in Basingstoke, it's costing them a fortune. It causes all sorts of problems, and we don't seem to have any control over this. And, you know, we keep on about building the right houses in the right places. Well, clearly this is a pretty good example of that's not happening. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Councillor Tilbury. I think there's a few points there. I think on the regulatory planning, the paper before us is for housing allocations, which, as we know, is essentially allocation of a resource. And I think the planning policy debate about, are we delivering the right houses in the right places with the right mix, that's potentially something to pick up as part of the new local plan. I know that every member will have a different view on that, and I'm sure that there's lots of grounds that we'd agree on, but that's potentially a slightly separate thing. There are policies in place through the local plan which says what the housing mix should be, that's based on market data and all sorts, but that's potentially a slightly separate conversation. I think on the rural parish connections, and we both represent rural wards, and it's something that's very important to parish councils in particular, that when houses are delivered, that local people with local connection have the opportunity to bid on them and to take them up. I think what's worth saying is, as part of 2.8, it says 53% of those properties were let to households with a local connection to the parish. The primary reason for this was that locally connected residents on the register did not place a bid. Now, I appreciate we get into a slightly circular argument about were they the right properties in the first place, but the broad point there is that the ability for people to place a bid and exercise that local connection to the parish is there. So if people live in the parish, they're on the housing waiting list, and they want to express an interest in a property in their parish, the ability is there to do so. And what we're saying is, of the properties delivered in rural areas, 53% of people did have a local parish connection. But it's worth saying that the people on the housing list generally all have a local connection to the borough as a whole. So while 53% of those residents came from the parish, the other 47 came from Basingstoke and Deane as a wider whole. So it's not fair to say that residents are coming from outside. We are still making sure that we are prioritising good quality affordable homes for local people as part of that. I don't know if Kate and Sue have got anything to add to that.
I would just say it's not exclusive to flats. It's you know, general across the board. You know, it's not always that people with a parish connection are choosing to bid on properties, but your point, it is people in the borough with a local connection to us, and they are choosing to bid on those areas.
I don't know if that's helpful, Councillor Tilbury.
Yeah, so I think we know the issues, but I think the point is we're building lots of houses. People will bid on them. Then we get all sorts of problems where they're sort of trying to get back out of the village because it's costing them a fortune to live here, because they're, you know, just the cost of travelling to Basingstoke, you know, invariably they tend to be in lower paid occupations. And the minute you've got to start travelling, you know, the bus to Owen, that's £10 a day back towards to Basingstoke. If you're only earning 150 quid a week, you know, that's making a big dent in your sort of, you know, your outgoings and all these sort of things. Whereas what the, you know, most of these people there, and of course it begs the obvious question, the argument we were put forward that we needed these houses in the villages because there was a local need, and clearly there isn't a local need because people don't want to live in them, you know. Either there are people on there who possibly could bid on these properties, but they're choosing not to. But what does that tell you? You know, I mean, there are some people, you know, most people I deal with are that desperate, they would bid for anything. The fact is a lot of these people who are on there, and the other problem I find is that a lot of them are people who could bid for them aren't allowed to go on the thing because their income's too high. You know, people who are on £20,000 a year and we're saying, no, you can meet your need in the private sector. So we got this perverse situation where, you know, the people who, you know, we would expect to be on the list aren't even allowed to register, and yet we've still got a massive housing list. So, you know, the reality is, you know, it could be a lot worse. But, you know, we see people all the time around the village who are desperate to get into social housing, but are trapped in the private rented sector where they're paying extortionate rents. The only difference is now we're seeing extortionate rents in the social sector, you know, 166 quid a week for a 2-bedroom flat, you know, flat in, and then they're going to whack a load of service charges on top of that now. And the only people who can afford that are people on benefits. It's getting a bit crazy, but again, it's just losing support for what was always seen as a good policy. That's the real tragedy. And, you know, and that's, you know, where I'm coming from is it's becoming indefensible to support this level of development now. Thank you.
I don't
Thank
know
you.
if Roberts wants to answer that, but I don't think there's any more questions there.
I think just on the points generally, I would agree that we need to make sure we're delivering the right homes in the right places. On the income thresholds, the income threshold is £50,000 for a household, or if a household has more than £30,000 in savings, you have to be over that threshold to not be allowed on the housing register. I think we had that debate at EPH a number of years ago, I know, and members had views on, you know, was £50,000 as a household income, you know, too high, and actually we should be prioritising it for households on lower, or £30,000 in savings, the same conversation. So I think we've struck a reasonable balance on all sides as part of that. And I do think it's interesting when we have these debates, because I think partially you answered part of your own question there, in that we're building these houses in some more rural areas where people don't necessarily then bid on them as local connection. But as you said, often when people have gone onto these housing registers, they are looking across the whole borough. While they might have a local connection to the place that they've lived, you know, as you say, they might be on a low paid job in Overton or Whitchurch, for example, and actually they're on the housing list because they want a property in Basingstoke because they're working in Basingstoke, and they don't want to have to pay to travel backwards and forwards each day. So it's all of these different things that we've got to weigh up, which is quite challenging, but we just need to make sure that we do have the right accommodation, and in the main we make sure it gets to the right people. I don't know who was next, Chair.
Next person was Councillor George.
You're on your mute face, Dave.
On mute at the moment. Thank you. Just on that, Tristan, on 2.8, I may be pedantic here, but can I be clarifying, when you say the town, do you mean Basingstoke?
Yes, apologies.
Yes, it's just we have more than one town in the borough. And secondly,
we do.
So,
we have Basingstoke and Tadley.
Yeah, and Whitchurch.
And Whitchurch.
Yes.
They've got a town there.
So sometimes we find this. So you're basically saying anything outside of Basingstoke town is a rural area. Is that clear?
For the purposes of the policy here, the rural connection is anybody outside of the urban area of Basingstoke town. Yes.
Thank you. All right. I just wanted to clarify.
I think that's an interesting point, and I think one that we can pick up when we present this in future years, and just make that clear, that when we're talking about rural areas, we are including Tadley, Whitchurch. That would be helpful, I think.
It would be. Basingstoke's the biggest town in Hampshire, so it's fairly large. I've got Councillor Ashford as comment asked to go to list, so I'll put you at the end. Councillor Harvey was next on my list.
Thank you, Chair. Tristan, can I agree with you about the on-site comment you made? And I think that's incredibly important. I guess what's a slight worry, I know you've got a briefing on the white paper coming up as soon as well, but I would not want to see government policy shift away from on-site contributions to basically taking off-site contributions in lieu of. And I think that would be a very retrograde step. Again, it's the localism point, isn't it? For us in Basingstoke, that matters tremendously to mixed and balanced communities. So I would hope as a council, if we agree, I'll be advocating for it, that from a respective proposal to the white paper, we say, no, we don't want to see the dilution of on-site to off-site. Could I raise
just to jump in on that, Councillor Harvey, I would agree entirely. I think we should be pushing for on-site wherever possible. And the other point I would make as part of the government's white paper, and you pay your money, you take your choice with the government's white paper, but also I wouldn't be supportive of the measures that are in there to say that they're not requiring affordable housing contributions on anything under 50 dwellings.
Yeah.
I think that's the wrong move as well. And I think broadly we can get member agreement on that, and we can form that in our response.
I've got to be honest, just if I could give you a list as long as your arm about the white paper and what's wrong with it. Very little's right with it, unfortunately. And I'm not criticising the government just for the sake of criticising the government. It's a pretty poor white paper for any government to come forward with, actually. And it won't be surprised that I'm raising this point then, really, and Kate and Sue will smile, I'm sure. Flatted development, the allocations policy, putting families into, and I know you've got the section here, 211 in the appendices, in upper floor flats. One of the reasons we've got a significant number of delivery, which is good, always good, is because of Vivid, for example, and Vivid's contribution to that. And they do build a lot in the borough, but they do build flats. And as a social landlord, I struggle with them building flats that we then nominate families to live in. And then they've got to manage the problem that's created by families living in upper floor flats. It just seems to be circular madness in that regard. And so the issue really becomes one of how we deal with the allocation. I can deal with the planning side, and we'll pick that up in the local plan. But I want to talk about the allocation side of how people can deal with their circumstances changing. Because a family might move in with a young child that then grows up in a flat that really is unsuited to them. And it isn't so much that they have to get a medical need or a social need, or they're forced into that sort of desperate measure to get out. It's how we might be able to enable them to move on to accommodation that is perhaps more suitable, where just those criteria, you've got them down here in the report of the reasons why, you know, their accommodation is assessed as unsuitable, they're overcrowded, their medical, social, or mental health issues are requiring a move or under. It might just be that their circumstances are such that they have a grown-up family now, and that they want to change because of that, but they're trapped because they've gone off the register, they've gone through the process, if you like. So that's really from an allocations point of view, and you will understand it far better than I do. But the experience of casework is that families do feel trapped. And I'm just, at the moment, we've got a 100% flatted development coming our way from Vivid. And my concern is we're stoking the problem into the future. And I don't see them taking it seriously. The development arm of one is not talking to the housing management arm of the other, which seems to be a bit of a problem, to say the least. What is Vivid? Is it a house building company, or is it housing management and social landlord? And the two aren't quite marrying up in my mind at the moment, and I'm trying to grapple with that with colleagues. So your comments, please, on the allocations policy, what we might be able to do positively and constructively to deal with this problem would be really welcome, I think. Thank you.
Shall I come in first from a sort of strategic overview, and then Sue could probably sort of add to that. But the housing policy, although it's fixed in terms of the wording, is quite pragmatic in terms of its interpretation. So a household's circumstances are individual to themselves, not just themselves, but to a point in time as well. And I think that the policy as drafted does allow for that discretional, well, that was the situation, then we can take a look now and take a revised view. That may not necessarily be result in a different decision, in that they may well be still judged to be in suitable accommodation, but it's very circumstances based. It's a very individual assessment. So in terms of assurance, I would sort of underline the fact that an individual assessment is made rather than a carte blanche. I did notice that the report that you've received doesn't actually have the breakdown. I don't know what happened in the translation from the report on our systems to yours, but actually we had 58% houses to 42% flats. That's section, right page, that's section 3.4.2, one of the headlines, little 4. So I don't think it's fair to suggest that there's an overriding dominance of issues around flatter developments. I think for some people they cause problems. And there is also an issue that we've had in terms of applicants making informed choices, whether or not they wish to elect to go to either a house or a flat. And some people do prefer, some households do prefer flats to houses. And it's, you know, you could speak to one household and say it's harder living with younger children in flats or with older children in flats. It's a very individual thing. In terms of our response as a statutory consultee to the planning process, we will outline what levels of demand are for, but not be prescriptive and say that that can be accommodated in terms of flats. What will be suitable, and Councillor Robinson has already touched on the fact that planning policy deals with what will be a suitable development in a suitable location. Isn't something that's driven by the allocation policy. The allocation policy highlights levels of need and demand. It doesn't set out that certain types of accommodation have to be provided in certain locations.
Hopefully that's helpful. I don't know whether Sue, you've got anything to add?
No, really only to say that, you know, of course, we nominate people who choose to place bids on flats. The waiting times between flats and houses aren't that too different at the moment. So people are making a kind of informed choice. And of those people that have got children that apply to go back onto the register, more are accepted to go on than are refused to go on, because as Kate was saying, it's not, you know, you've got to have a medical or a something else. We take individual circumstances into consideration. Some, of course, don't qualify, but more often than not, people are. That was all.
No, thank you. Can I just come back on that quickly in terms of it? I think the point about informed choices is really important, and how people are informed so that it is a genuinely informed choice, I think, is interesting. I do think there is an issue, and I'm looking at this from a planning point of view, particularly, and obviously it relates. If we have a developer providing affordable housing in flats, and it is predominantly 2-bedroom flats, and the allocations policy, simply because of the nature of it and the nature of the circumstances, is then leading to families in the main taking those 2-bedroom flats for what a whole host of reasons you both rightly say, and I don't disagree with anything you said, then the issue becomes one of how we support those families or how they are dealt with, particularly if the design of the flat in itself, even though it's affordable, prevents or creates issues. And a very good example was the conversation we've had where the developer in question was saying, yeah, I'm going to put bike storage in the flat, but they'd forgotten about pushchairs, and they hadn't considered the idea of families living in a flat. So the balcony issue wasn't dealt with, it was retrospectively dealt with. And all of those little points that are very relevant to putting a family in a flat hadn't been considered, but the allocations policy and the nature of the process had led to those families living in those flats. And I just think there's a whole range of things here, and maybe on a number of policy fronts. It's not just your own housing or the allocations policy. There's a number of bits of this puzzle that are leading to problems that we're picking up in casework for families. And it's not the first time you've both heard of that. It really isn't. So I respect that, but we're still looking for answers.
I
think it's one of those. It's one of those things that we know comes up every year, and we do need to find a better answer. And I hope that as part of the local plan process, we can provide more direction to developers on what they should be building in our town. I think that is the only way. I think in the main, the housing team have a good relationship with the registered social landlords, and we can exercise, you know, preferences, and we do have genuine changes result as a result of the pressure exerted by officers. But I think we need to take potentially a more active approach through the new local plan in terms of saying to developers, this is what we would like to see. And if you are providing affordable housing, then actually that needs to be arranged too, not just, oh, you're providing affordable, therefore it's in a block of flats. Actually, it's affordable 2, 3, 4 bedroom homes. You know, affordable 4-bedroom homes do exist. Dare I say it, they're like, I'm trying to think of a polite term. Yes, they're very rare, but they do exist. And we need to make sure that those are delivered, because the good developers will do that anyway, but we need to encourage those developers who aren't as prepared to work with us to take them along that journey to help deliver the homes we want to see in our borough.
I agree. Tristan, my point about the development is, I guess, particularly from a partner like Vivid, and I know each site is different and site constraints lead particular developers down particular lines of design and particular proposals. But on a brownfield site, which is the ability to do perhaps something quite innovative, to come up with a 100% flatted development from one of our social landlords leads me to question why our policy frameworks allow that to happen from one of our social landlords, other than just a viability argument that says, I've got to stack it and rack it because it's the only way I can make it work on that site. Well, if that's the case, there's got to be other things we can do to help change that dynamic, change that arithmetic to make it a better development, particularly if it's such a good site in the town centre. Thank you, Chair.
I think it's a really interesting point, and certainly RSLs are concerned about. In my experience, developers are concerned about what they build and how that looks, because ultimately they're trying to sell that to an end user, and to do that it needs to look right and it needs to be delivered right and the quality needs to be there, but only for the initial stage. For an RSL, they look at things through a different lens. An RSL looks at something and says, how am I going to maintain this in the future? Because a developer, often on a private development, has sold a significant, in the case of a development in Basingstoke, has sold 60% of units and given 40% over to an RSL. And the traditional model by one of the big 4 house developers would say, I'm really interested in the 60%, we're selling that. And then the 40% goes to the HA and we walk away. That's what a big 4 developer would do. What an RSL is concerned about as a developer is, how much is this going to cost me to maintain? What provisions are we putting into this development to create a simple management structure for it? And those are all the conversations that we need to align with those as part of those local plan discussions with the providers who want to build in our town, RSLs and developers, to make sure we're getting the right balance.
I think Councillor Harvey was finished with that, so I'll go on with Councillor Taylor's next on my list.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, firstly, I'd like to thank the housing team, because they've dealt with cases for me in the past, and not only have they done that very professionally, they've also done that with a very human face, and I think that's really important when we're dealing with housing and homing issues. I'd like to take the opportunity to firstly respond to Councillor Robinson's request for our views about HMOs, and then I've got a very specific question. The role of HMOs in ensuring a suitable supply of accommodation, I'm assuming by that you mean in terms of single people rather than families. As somebody with grown-up
in that context, yes.
Yeah. As somebody who has grown up children who've had the fortune or misfortune to use HMSOs, I can give some views from a variety of perspectives. And the first is that it really doesn't matter how well run an HMO is, it's not a home. And single people are entitled to homes, not just a roof over their head. And on many occasions, these roofs over their heads are little more space than my office that I happen to be in. And they're expected to live, sleep, eat, and feel like it's a home and have all you know, personal possessions and so on. And I can honestly say that they don't. You know, they work as a temporary stopgap, and it's very useful if you're homeless, but it's not a home, and it's not really what single people want. In any event, it's not really a viable proposition to solving the problem we have for single people. Looking at some of the statistics, you know, there are 2,630 single people on the register, you know, in your report. And currently we only have 84 HMOs. And I calculate based on the average occupation of an HMO, we would need something like an additional 500 to meet the demand that we have. So HMOs are not particularly good from the point of view of the people that live in them. It's not a good strategic option because we could never get that many HMOs in the borough. And also residents don't like HMOs. I'll try and give you an example of why. Looking at our HMO list that we have on our website, there are 5 in Lehar Close in Brighton Hill. That's 5 HMOs in one road. Now, whenever I talk to residents in that road, they always bring to my attention the problems that those HMO brings for them. 6 extra cars in a place where there's no car parking for each one. Noise, bins, there's never enough bins, you know, there's all sorts of problems that neighbours and the rest of the people in the road will have. And so we have HMOs in an unacceptable density sometimes in particular local areas. And also they're really not great to live in, and they're not great for people, you know, in whose street they happen to be either, because they have an impact on the normal daily lives of the other people. So I would try to encourage you not to think of that as a strategic option to solving the problem, because apart from anything else, you simply cannot get that many HMSOs to solve the kind of problem that we've got. And I guess that leads on to my sort of much more specific question, which is looking through this report, which I appreciate is a review, you know, it's a historical review. It seems to me that in the last 4 years, applications to the housing register have nearly doubled. And at the moment, the biggest number of applicants are single people. Most of those are going to be young people, but not all of them. And you say yourself in your report that demand is outstripping available properties at the rate of 10 to 1 for that applicant group. So really my very specific question is, what action have we taken in the last year to close the gap between supply and demand for this group of people? And if we haven't taken specific actions that have resulted in any kind of closure of that gap, what plans have we developed to do so? Thank you.
Thank you. Just bear with me a moment. I'm just on the HMOs point. Forgive me. I think it wasn't entirely clear what I meant, although I appreciate I've reread what I said and it didn't say what I meant. It didn't read as what I meant either. For HMOs, one of the things I've been exploring with officers is if we could have HMOs run by Vivid, Sovereign, another housing provider, you know, be that Vivid, Sovereign, Stonewater, Clarion, Hyde, we can take a pick on a registered provider, because a lot of the challenges with HMOs that I see and that come to me through casework and from other members from casework is around management. And if we can square that management point, in that if it was run, but often HMOs can be, and this isn't always the case, but they can be run in a not particularly positive fashion by an individual. Equally, they can be run by an individual in good circumstances, that's worth saying as well, but often not the case, as we have seen in the experience in the borough. So one of the things I'm trying to explore is, can we get a registered partner, registered provider, a Vivid or a Sovereign interested in doing that? And I would just appreciate what you say about HMOs and your son and daughter's experience of that. Equally, I would say my sister has been living in a HMO for the last 7 years. And it is very much her home, and she is very happy there, and she wants to stay there. She's been in this current one, I think, for 4 years, and she has every intention of staying there until she hopefully has saved up enough money to buy a property of her own. So often that arrangement can work. And with people who've often lived in some form of HMO at university, perhaps, when they return, they want to live in a HMO with friends rather than living with parents. So it can work. That's not to say that it works for everybody. So in response to responding to the single person's need that you rightly identify as going up exponentially, I do wonder whether if we could square away that management point, whether HMOs could be part of the solution. As part of other solutions, it is working with registered providers to ensure that we have one bedroom flats is predominantly the way to do that, purely on costs. One bedroom homes are few and far between, certainly. I don't know if Kate and Sue have got anything to add to that. Kate?
No, I think in terms of what is the strategy is to be also opportunistic. We've had examples during the last year at Chinham House where we've brought our own properties back into use and been able to develop accommodation. We're also looking at any opportunity that presents itself in terms of addressing levels of unmet single person's need. So there is opportunism, there is being strategic, and there is informing the planning process in the way that we've described. So it's a number of opportunities that we'll take. Not one size will fit all. But sorry.
No, go on, Kate.
No, I mean, you only have to look at the statistics, which we haven't come back to in terms of homelessness in COVID, that it was the single people. I think of all the 80 odd households that we placed into emergency accommodation, over 70 of those were single people. So that's where the pressure points are. And if we're closing off HMOs as an option, it creates massive difficulties and blockages in terms of being able to come up with workable solutions.
Before I let Kim come back in, I would be careful with HMOs having too many in one area. You did mention the street when there's 6 and it changes the nature of that street. We've got one in the next street that thankfully hasn't got planning permission, so it's got to be turned back. But that one house is just upset the whole street, changed the whole street dynamic. Everyone wants to move out, whereas before it was a happy neighbourhood. So I'll be really careful where you put them and make sure they're well pepper potted. Otherwise, they could really change a family area of housing into something we don't want. So yes, there are probably potential for that. But
it's a difficult balance.
Yeah, we've got to be careful we don't cause the problem in Brighton Hill where there's 6 in one street and it's totally changed the area. So I'd just like to make that comment. If Councillor Taylor, you've got anything further? Councillor Taylor,
you're on mute, Councillor Taylor.
Sorry. Really, just to sort of reiterate that point, and I think that about HMOs not being, it's not a lifeline for us because you'd need so many of them to make even a dent in it, and the fact that it is really disruptive in the local area that causes a big problem. I am concerned that we actually don't seem to have produced a documented strategic approach to dealing with the issues for single people, because that, clearly what we're seeing is crisis levels looking at these numbers. And I think that I get entirely being opportunist when we can, but I think that we need to be a little bit more up of a planned approach, to be honest. We need to really set down what our plans are. Otherwise, we're not tackling that. And what we're saying is we don't care about single people in Basingstoke. And when that happens, what we're going to do is continue to get an aging population, and that won't do us any good at all in the town. So really, those are my observations. And I think HMSOs run by housing associations are called flats.
I would just respond to one comment you've made there, Councillor Taylor. I would completely refute the accusation that there's no plan for this. At full council in July, full council approved the new housing and homelessness strategy for the period from 2020 to 2024, which builds on the previous strategy. And in there, it's noted under our strategic outcomes, priority objective, develop and improve the range of sustainable and supported housing and shared schemes for single homeless. It's named in there as a strategic priority. It's absolutely on the agenda. It was approved by full council unanimously in July, so it's very much on the agenda. I can send the link through to you, but it's on the council's website, so it's very much front and centre of the work that the housing team are doing.
Can I just add one thing as well about HMOs in terms of the preparatory work that sort of goes into proposals? That there are some schemes that we are developing in conjunction with ward members where there hasn't been a sort of presumption against HMOs. Lots of concerns, lots of worries, but actually when looking at the property, the location, the way it's going to be managed by a registered provider, there's been a great openness from ward members. So I think, and that's not to say that, you know, how we engage with members doesn't actually, you know, we need to do that at the earliest opportunity. But I think if we start off thinking that all HMOs are bad, to rule them out of the equation, we wouldn't get anywhere. There are some great opportunities and some great housing schemes that will be coming forward as a result of sort of the open-mindedness around the contribution that some HMOs can make.
Thank you.
Thanks. I've got Carruthers and Ashfield still wishing to speak. Councillor George, you did indicate, but you're taking it down. You still got questions, or I'd put you on the end of the list, or?
No, thank you. Councillor Kim Taylor hit my point on absolutely. So it's just it's going to be on HMOs. So thank you. That's covered entirely. Thank you.
Yeah, I would say I can see a use for HMOs, but it's got to be the right location. In the middle of a street that's full of families, maybe not the best place. But if Councillor Carruthers would like to ask her questions now.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to officers for what's a very detailed report, and of course for all their hard work that they do year round. It's really encouraging to see that there's an increase in vacancy, especially that there's a reduction in the number of families on the housing list. In terms of HMOs, my view is we absolutely need to explore this. The numbers of single people looking for on the housing list are really high. Unfortunately, the current situation is not going to do anything to help that, and we absolutely need to look into solutions. So I would certainly support us doing some research and investigating that as an option. A question I've got is about under occupancy. I noticed in the report that there's 125 transfer applicants at the moment, which are nearly all due to under occupancy. And those people sit at level 1 and by the look of it, choose generally to stay where they are. Meanwhile, we've got 88 applicants, which are currently in second floor flats, unsuitably so. We've got 25% it's unsuitable, 42% are overcrowded, and 25% have health issues. What do we do to incentivise people who are under occupying to move on? Obviously, we can't force them to do so, but you know, how are we working with them to try to encourage that?
I don't know if Kate wants to go first on that one. You're on mute, Kate.
Yeah. Sue, did you want to pick up the incentives within the policy in terms of giving overriding priority?
You're on mute as well, Sue. We all got remuted by Democratic Services.
Yeah, so in terms of the policy, if you have somebody that's a housing association tenant and they're under occupying their accommodation by 2 rooms, we do place them into band 1, which is the overriding priority band. And it really is because you would normally stay in that band for 3 months, but when you're looking at making that move from your family home, we do allow them to stay in that band until there is something that they want to move to. So that's how we try to encourage them. They're then very well placed should a property come up that they want to move to and they're eligible for.
Predominantly, however, it is a case of carrot rather than stick.
Yeah.
It's, you know, if people choose to move, then the incentives and assistance is there to help them. But unfortunately, moving is an emotional choice as well as one that's ruled by the head. So it's not one that it's not one, which is why you see so many people that are registered to move, but not actually affecting that move.
It's something I think is worth saying. Yeah, it's something I think it's worth saying the team work with residents very sensitively on, because as Kate says, it's not an entirely illogical decision, and we have to respect people's wishes while encouraging them to move if they are under occupying a property which could be better utilised for a different person on the waiting list. So it is a challenge.
Thank you. I do appreciate that. There obviously has to be a great deal of sensitivity around the issue. But thank you for answering my questions.
Okay, and my final.
Thank you very much.
My final speaker is Councillor Ashfield.
Thank you very much. A couple of comments first of all. I wasn't going to talk about HMOs. I don't have a great deal of experience with them, but I thought it was interesting what Councillor Franken was talking about. There was a contradiction there about making sure that we pepper pot HMOs, but then also the complaint about being this particular HMO being within a street of families. And I think as councillors, if we are wanting to sort of integrate this kind of housing, we also have to take the rough with the smooth with it. So that was more of a comment than anything else. My next comment was picking up on a much earlier comment from Councillor Tilbury. As a rural ward councillor, we are of a ward where we've taken a lot of new housing lately. We do have to use affordable housing as a really strong argument to get buy-in from the community for more housing. So it is important, whether or not it's part of the policy or not, it is important that we get the right mix of housing built for the local need. But I do struggle with us dealing in anecdotes in all of this, you know, that the person that works in Basingstoke on 150 quid a week or what have you. And I would really like to see some voice of the resident in here, because I think none of us here on this call, I might be wrong, are on the housing list or bid on a house. And I think it would be really worthwhile to understand, you know, what does stop certain people bidding when there are houses that are available. I think I'm right in saying that although we've had a lot of housing built in Whitchurch, we haven't seen a material change in the size of our housing list. And I think it would be worthwhile us understanding that a bit more, because, like I say, anecdote isn't really a strong basis for decision making. But my actual question, which has now actually been kind of picked up by Councillor Carruthers about, I mean, one was specifically around 4+ bedroom houses. I know that they are, I think Councillor Robinson was looking for that, rare as hen's teeth.
That's the one I was looking for, thank you.
I don't know what rude thing he was thinking of this time of the evening.
Something to do with rocking horses, I think I was on.
It's great to see that waiting time has come down, but you know, I have to be honest with you, I've got a youngish family of 3 children. Yeah, we need a certain number of bedrooms here, but I hope, I mean, I really hope that 10 years from now, they're not going to be living here. And I could quite happily live in that 1-bedroom flat or 2-bedroom house. So the requirement for 4+ bedroom houses, in the most part, are a short period of time. You know, when a family is very busy and they're spending half of that time on a waiting list, that's frustrating. And I do appreciate the points that have been made around the sensitivities around it. But I think it would be good to explore fixed term tenancies for those larger sort of tenures. I think maybe to give as well the housing associations confidence to build them as well. And I think if we work proactively from day one with residents, with tenants, taking on a fixed term tenancy of say 10 or 15 years and work with them towards, you know, within the last 2 or 3 years of that tenancy, because circumstances might be that it's not appropriate for them to leave a 4-bedroom house. But, you know, if we are working with them on that basis and assuring them a 3 or a 2-bedroom house of a similar area of similar quality, I think that would be something that, you know, most people are reasonable and pragmatic and would think, you know, I needed that 4-bedroom house at that time in my life, and I recognise that somebody else in 20 years from now their need is going to be greater. So I think if we go into it with much more sort of open arrangement like that, rather than then 10, 15 years down the line or many years later trying to then use that carrot to sort of move them out of a house that they're very, very settled in by that point, is difficult. So I'd like us to sort of explore that a bit more. That's it.
Those are
just before Councillor Robinson, the particular HMO I'm referring to is not particularly well run. I've got to be really careful what I say. They've had armed response and all sorts there. There are a number of issues. They've picked all the time safer people. So that's what I say about pepper potting. If you've got someone with an issue, don't put them all together. If in the same house, you want to put them apart so that they help each bring their own standards up. So that particular one's got really significant issues and never got planning permission before they converted the house. But I have seen other good examples of HMOs working very well. So yeah, that one is the worst example you could get of a HMO. So I just wanted to sort of clarify, but I've got to be careful because then it's only the next close along, and I know the owners and things like that.
Thank you. I think a really interesting point you raised, Councillor Ashfield, on the Whitchurch specific point. I think we can probably take away and try and do a bit more analysis around Whitchurch particularly, if that would be helpful, and looking at the size of the list, the numbers of houses delivered and what impact that's had on the local list. I think that would be helpful to understand. I'm seeing slightly scared faces with officers, but I'm sure we can do that. Oh no, not scared faces. That's okay. I'm adding to the list of things to do. Not by tomorrow, but yes, we'll get that done. I think in the point you raised about fixed term tenancy is a really interesting one, and that's potentially something I'd welcome views from the wider committee on. I can see the merits on it. I can also see some challenges, which I think we can all see. But the principle of saying to a new family that yes, you can have this 4-bedroom house for the next, say, 20 years, I'm plucking a figure out of thin air, that potentially sees through your need for that property. If there's a need to extend that at the end, because maybe there's more children come along the way and there's a need to extend that for another 5-10 years, then that's fine. But the principle of having that fixed term so that people know that, you know, this house is a family house, and that, as you say, most people are reasonable and understand that, you know, somebody else's need may be greater than their own at some point in the future. That's something we could think about. That's something we could explore. I don't know if Kate and Sue have got any comments on that.
I think it was an enlightening suggestion, really, because what housing associations have tended to do is look at fixed term tenancies across the piece. So either they've looked at their whole stock, and most of them are moving away from fixed term tenancies because you know, it's just not worked for them. But actually, I think Sue and I will undertake to take that back, particularly through the 3 larger providers, which are Clarion, Vivid and Sovereign, our liaison group meetings with them, and ask them to give that some thought, because you know, fixed term tenancies weren't supposed to be about managing antisocial behaviour or some of the things that RPs sort of grabbed onto with, if we don't like them, we can ask them to move on. It was about that social housing resource meeting the need for the period of time that it was occupied, and that's, you know, an ideal example. So we will take that back, and we'll come back to you directly, Councillor Ashford, as soon as we've had some response for them. Yeah.
I'm seeing a wave from Councillor Tilbury.
Yeah, I've got 3 names. He's second on my list. I've got Carruthers, Tilbury, and Miller. I don't think Councillor Miller spoke before, and the other 2 have. So I think I'll take Councillor Miller first.
Thank you very much. Hopefully this will be fairly short and sweet. Really, it's aimed at, I think, probably Kate and Sue, but no doubt Tristan can decide it. It's very quickly on page 8 of Appendix 1. I welcome the inclusion of a mention of the Armed Forces Covenant for a local connection. As you probably know, I'm the Armed Forces Champion for Basingstoke and Dean Borough Council. But I'm just looking at this, of the number of households on the register, 46 applicants were not required to meet the local connection because they're current or former members of the armed forces. Then it says 3 applicants fulfilling this criteria were also housed. Is that 3 of the 46 or an extra 3? It's just the wording. I just wanted to be clear about that. As I say,
it's 3 of the 46 were actually housed in that period of time.
Thanks very much. And this particular subject, it's very high profile. I belong to well, in 2 guises, on a partnership between ourselves, Hart and Rushmore. And believe it or not, I'm not sure all members are aware, we have a very high proportion in Hampshire of both retired armed forces and current serving armed forces. And it's the Armed Forces Covenant is designed to cover them. And I've discussed this with Kate before, and also with the portfolio holder. And this is a very good example. I can take this away and I can demonstrate that this council is working very positively in this particular case, because it's one of the biggest things that's of concern as far as the armed forces are concerned, because of the changing in profile of the way that the armed forces are serving within this country. It's not that it's very different to the time that I served, and they're putting down roots quite early. So this is a very good example of what we're achieving as a council. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Miller. That's great, and I would agree. I think it's really important that we do everything we can under our commitment to the Armed Forces Covenant. We've got the British Army and Aldershot and Borden not too far away. We've got RAF Odium, and then clearly you've got a larger defence cluster down at Portsmouth in terms of the Navy, etc. So we've got all 3 services very close to our doorstep, and it's very important that we do everything we can to ensure their fair treatment.
Got 1 army base actually in the ward just. Councillor Crothers, your hand has gone down. You still got a question, or been answered? No question. Okay, Councillor Tilbury, you were next to.
You oh, hello, yeah. Just want to come back, well, briefly on HMOs. I mean, I think there's a role for HMOs, but what we don't want is the sort of conversions we've seen in that Paul referred to, and I'm aware when I was on DC, the nightmare in Millard Close, where we had like loads and loads of them there, totally inappropriate, usually issues around parking, all those sort of things. Design one on a new estate with adequate parking and decent spacing. It may, you know, it's possibly a way forward, and it is probably the only option, you know, and run by a registered provider. Yeah, got to be better. I mean, having dealt with the one my son's been living in recently, you know, so the place caught fire. I mean, all sorts of issues, you know, those sorts of places were just bad house conversions. They're no way forward, are they? But properly done, it could be part of a solution. I wanted to come back on the point I made earlier. You know, I referred to about the £50,000, but that's, you know, for what you're saying, Tristan, it implies that if you have a household income of less than £50,000 per annum, you can go on the housing register. But my experience is you can't, because it's covered by the Have a Housing Need one. And it's, yeah, Kate's nodding her head. You know, I've had instances where people are on considerably less than that, barely £20,000, I mean, from memory, but because at that level you can rent a 1-bedroom flat as a single person in the private rental sector, that meets the housing, you don't meet the housing need criteria. You know, isn't a £50,000, that's the maximum, because that's a lot of money, £50,000.
Yeah, it's not, you're right, it's not a blanket £50,000, it's one of the criteria, so you do have to have a demonstrated housing need.
It's very misleading, because a lot of people think that's, you know, well, it's all, you know, you can be incredibly rich and be on the housing register, but in reality, there's also the other provision that, you know, we do look at household income and say you can go in the private sector, and, you know, and that's not a long-term solution. You know, like HMOs, yeah, they're great if you're a student or if you're just started work in a new area, but again, not a long-term solution. Maybe it may suit some people, but, you know, for most people, it's somewhere you're going to live for a year or two. You want to be able to move on. And the other thing, to come back on Chloe's point about with the larger housing, what we used to do, the council and the housing associations did for a while after we were sort of privatised, well, they took over our housing, but they used to offer an incentive to people to move out of houses they were under occupying of about £1,500, because, you know, it actually costs a lot of money to move out of a house. And I can think of one instance, lady I dealt with who looked into this. They'd stopped doing this grant, which was about £800 or £900, whatever it was. So that option wasn't there. I had one that did move in that when it was still in place. Another one looked at it a few years ago, looked to move to a more modern 2-bedroom flat out of a 3-bedroomed house that she was in her own on. But the problem was, when you looked at it, the rents were roughly the same anyway. But and by the time you've added all the cost of moving, because it's quite a lot of money to move house, new carpets, curtains, all those sorts of things, and the fact that there was nowhere to dry your, this was another thing with the flat, nowhere to dry your washing. You'd have to buy a tumble dryer. You've got the cost of, and so I'd actually be worse off if I move into this smaller property. So although I'm under occupying, it makes financial sense to stay where I am. And there's those sort of things, unless there's an incentive there, people won't move, and giving them, you know, trying to force them out of the house doesn't help. And the bedroom tax didn't apply to her because she was retired anyway. So, you know, you'll get all these sort of things, but that was quite a good system. And I don't know why they dropped it. They did it to save money, but ironically, it's whether it's something we could possibly look at. You're reluctant to bail the housing associations out, but it was certainly, you know, there was quite a lot of churn in properties in those days. I even aware of quite a few that move using that system there, and I notice now that those sort of people are staying put. So, you know, it's just a point, but yeah. So the clarity on the 50,000 is, it does give a false impression that as long as you're earning less than £50,000, you can get on the housing list. You can't, sadly. Thank you.
Councillor Tristan, you want to comment?
Nothing to add other than yes, I think we can make that clear, and apologies if my wording didn't make that clear in terms of how people can apply. They do have to have a demonstrated housing need, because clearly we wouldn't want to be giving out properties or giving the opportunity to bid on properties for those people who didn't have a housing need. Where the matter for debate comes in clearly is assessing that need, and that's where the team of officers work incredibly hard with each individual on their individual circumstances to assess the best route for them. We need to ensure that we have the right properties in place to provide for the housing need in the borough.
Okay, I think that's answers the question. Councillor Nick Robinson, you're the next to indicate. No, all right, I'll put sleeve of hand up. Okay, that's everyone who's asked any questions. No more. This is no more. Okay, that report's to be noted for the moment. I don't think by the looks of it. So I'll.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you, members.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm
Thank you.
conscious we're coming up to 9:30, so we need to suspend standing orders because I don't think we'll get through the rest of the agenda in 10 minutes. And is there a need for a comfort break before we do the next agenda item, or are we happy to carry on? Looks like everybody seems to be happy to carry on. So do I get a seconder for suspending standing orders to go past 9:30? Is that agreed? Yeah, it looks agreed.
Till 10 o'clock, review at 10.
Review at 10. I'll try. Okay. Councillor Golding, would you like to present your paper?
Thank you, Councillor Frankham. The report before you presents the revenue forecast position for 2020-2021 as at June 2020. It feels almost out of date already, particularly with some of the announcements this evening, but we will go with the information in front of you. It also outlines the funding position from the impact of COVID-19 so far, and then rebases the budget. COVID continues to have a huge impact on the council's finances, with the most significant impact currently forecast to be in this financial year, although obviously this could change as the pandemic progresses. The estimated full year costs from COVID-19 are £5.98 million, which includes both £1.04 million additional costs and £4.94 million of reduced income. Table 1 on page 36 outlines the national funding allocation to the borough to help mitigate the financial impact of COVID-19 across the borough. And while welcome, the £2.13 million allocated to council directly does not actually compensate for our loss of income. So some further income is expected and may compensate for around 75 pence of every £1 lost. Therefore, in order to mitigate this shortfall, the budget has been reviewed line by line, and tighter controls of spending were introduced, which included a recruitment freeze. The transformation project work was also brought forward to support effective working from home for our staff. These steps, alongside our historic strong management of our finances, does put the council in a relatively strong position to continue dealing with the financial impact of COVID-19. And that should not be taken for granted, because I suspect other councils about this time are not having such a comfortable conversation. Alongside working on our internal finances, officers have been working incredibly hard to support local businesses and residents, and this work, and in addition to all their other normal work, should not be underestimated. You already heard some of that on the first substantive item of the agenda, but I would like to take the time to stress that point further. Our officers were among the first to distribute the original business rates funding grant, but also led the way across Hampshire with a scheme for the discretionary grants scheme, and other local authorities actually followed the process that our officers had devised, which meant it was equitable across the county. I suspect I'm not the only member in this meeting who was contacted by a small business feeling the impact of COVID-19, or who heard their relief when they found out quickly about the support they could receive. This was not the same across the country, and I really would like to take the time to thank Lucy Gallier and her team specifically for that great work, and I hope the committee will join me in that. In summary, the financial climate does continue to be very challenging, and further work will need to be done to manage our finances this year. However, we shouldn't underestimate the good work that officers have done on this already across the council, making changes to their budgets, especially while all of them were also dealing with the extra work required because of COVID. So I'll now hand over to Sue Curden to talk you through some of the more details of the report.
Thank you, Councillor Golding. Councillor Golding has obviously noted some of the key aspects of the report, but I wanted to kind of reflect that the committee had expressed previously wanting to have an understanding of all the key elements of funding and how we were dealing with the various aspects of the financial impact. So the report is in a very different format to one that you've seen previously, and the idea being that actually we've given you some specific information about COVID, the different types of funding, as well as what we've received directly as a council, and to try to separate the two elements out so that you understand the COVID impact and what the impact is actually, because there's still business as usual activity going on. And what we wanted to do is present the information in the same way that we have provided information to MHCLG as part of our claims, so that we are consistent in our messaging. So as Councillor Golding has already pointed out, the impact is expected to be around 5.98 million, obviously at the end of June. We continue to update our forecasts and expect it to still be in a similar level. But obviously that was prior to announcements made yesterday and today, and we will continue to update those forecasts. We have, as Councillor Golding has noted, put measures in place, along with the delay in executive commitments, as noted on page 46 of the report, to generate an in-year saving of 1.64 million, leaving the residual budget gap of 2.21 million. The report also notes that at the time of doing the report, the business rates and council tax collection rates continue to be maintained. But obviously we are mindful of the fact that we're about to go into a period where a number of the business support measures are coming to an end, and furlough scheme is likely to come to an end. So therefore we need to continue to monitor this position. What I would say is that we have a significant element of the hardship fund to still allocate to this, because there was it was anticipated that further people would need to join the council tax reduction scheme throughout the year, and therefore we retained an element of funding in order to be able to support any new claimants as the year progressed. But obviously we'll have to keep that under review. And our business rates continue to maintain at their targeted level, but we need to be cognizant of the fact that nearly 50% of our businesses received 100% business rate relief. And so obviously what we'll be looking at in anticipation of the comprehensive spending review is what will happen to business rates if the current pandemic continues. So we don't actually expect to have a significant impact on our business rates in the current year. We would expect that impact possibly to come in future years when the current release come to an end. However, I would remind committee that whilst obviously it's discussed in further detail at Audit and Accounts Committee, when we set the budget, both council tax and business rates income actually accounts for a very small portion of our income for the council's finances. But obviously it is important that we maintain our collection rates where we can. Section 6 of the report, starting on page 39, reflects the specific details of the financial impact on the different services and the mitigations that have been in place. We've also thought it would be useful to add some commentary around how we've actually calculated the particular income forecasts, which we will continue to update throughout the year. So for example, some of the parking income we're hoping will be better than we originally forecast, because actually the restrictions were lifted before we originally assumed, and actually there's been a greater take-up of parking than we anticipated.
Which seems to have lost. So
obviously that will be updated as part of the monitoring as we go throughout the year.
So we lost you for a minute there.
Where did you last hear?
The parking revenue was higher because the car parks opened earlier.
Yeah, no, that's fine. So I was then going on to say that the obviously the current budget gap of 2.21 million is after being offset by the government funding we've received to date. The next big chunk of income that we expect to get is in relation to the income compensation scheme. And our first claim will be submitted next week, and that will cover the months of April and May. And we're expecting that claim to be in excess of £1 million. So therefore, our view is that based on the scheme as it stands, we would probably expect a significant element of the £2.21 million to be covered by the income compensation scheme. Clearly, that was based on, lockdown restrictions haven't been lifted. The good news, obviously, is that the various schemes are now up and running. What we will need to seek is understanding from central government whether these schemes will be extended to include any further impact from further restrictions that are put in place. However, if there is a residual budget gap at the end of the year, our current accounting policies that have been approved by Council would see that deficit offset against the MTFS risk reserve. And I would remind the committee, as part of the close down process, we put £0.74 million into that reserve in anticipation that there would be an impact on finances in the current year. But obviously, we also have other risk reserves that are set up for this purpose. And so if necessary, we will have to use reserves to close the budget gap. But as Councillor Golding has already said, we would look to try and make further measures, savings measures in year if necessary. But obviously, as the pandemic continues and any impact on the wider economy, it really is how long is a piece of string. So, you know, we will continue to monitor the situation, update as we go throughout the year. We've also made our kind of initial estimates in terms of what we think the future year's impacts will be, and that will be included in the initial report that will go to Cabinet in November on the administration's budget proposals for 21-22, and will be further updated in the final budget report to Council in February. The only other thing that I would add that's not in the report is obviously, whilst we're covering the support measures that have been put in place so far by central government and how we've administered them, there are two new schemes that are now coming to fruition, where we're just waiting for the final guidance, and that is the self-isolation income support scheme, which we as a council will have to administer, as well as new additional business grants, which are currently being piloted in local lockdown areas, where small businesses, as classified in the original grant process, will receive £1,000 every 3 months, every 3 weeks, I should say, that'd be a bit tight. And the larger businesses receiving £1,500 every 3 weeks. And again, we will be expected to administer those. So there is some further support directly for individuals and for businesses that we are being expected to put processes in place. But obviously what we don't know yet, it's too early to say, will there be anything additional for us as a council? So I don't think there's anything else I wanted to say about the report, but clearly happy to take any questions.
I've got 3 speakers so far. Councillor Harvey, McCormack and Ashfield. So I'll start with Councillor Harvey as he indicated first.
Thank you, Chair. Hannah, Sue, thank you for the report, appreciate it, and for all the work that's going on with the Treasury team. I mean, the detail of the report is really, really useful, and thank you for that, because it sets it out and really explains it. And I really appreciate the work that's going on, because I think we all know this isn't easy. We all know you're balancing no end of things to get it right or get it as close to possibly being as you can. And the consequences of some of the decisions that we may have to make, I think, are quite profound for local government and for our authority. And I know we are nowhere near in a position that I know another lot of local authorities are in. So from that perspective, that's another testament to the work you've done over many, many years, and the team have done over many, many years to keep the finances in good order. I guess the issue becomes one of organisational resilience, really. And looking at the point about vacancies and the recruitment freeze, really, I just wanted to ask a question around having vacancies and carrying vacancies and the importance of that necessarily in the strategy, but at the same time then having to employ agency staff to fill those vacancies to do the work that's perhaps required, and then how counterproductive that becomes, because those agency staff become as expensive as having an FTE. So why wouldn't you have the FTE doing the job in the first place if we're having to go for agency staff? So there's that sense of almost circular logic defeating ourselves, and in a sense, in particular areas, for example, the operations team, I wouldn't want to see vacancies, because those frontline services become pretty critical to residents at the moment, and we're already seeing a backlog of work in that regard. And so, having FTEs perhaps matters more than agency staff. And then my second question relates really just to the impact. And you take Hounds Mills, I mean, that's best part of £15 million income revenue to the council a year. That's just one business park, let alone our other business parks. And I'm conscious an awful lot of the business community haven't been able to access the grants and have been turned down for loans because they don't qualify, or because they're not in the right sector, or because they're in a position either being a new business or a business with not the correct records that the banks want, that they then suddenly find themselves on the wrong end of some decision by somebody somewhere in an office, or rather now working from home, who decides, well, no, I'm sorry, but you don't qualify under the government scheme for either a C bill or a B bill loan. And in those circumstances, that knock-on effect on those business parks could be huge. I'm also conscious of the furlough coming to an end, and other those business support grants coming to an end. And all right, I know you've got the other ones you've just said, Sue, but I just see going forward that hurdle, that obstacle of, for many of our business community, getting over that is going to be huge, because at the moment cash flow is king. And the cash flow issue is the problem that they're facing, that they can't get ready access to ready capital to pay wages, to cover taxes, or rents. And so an awful lot of the holidays are coming to an end as well. And so from that perspective, I could just see our bottom line being directly impacted significantly by those issues. I'm sure you're already taking it all under advice, it's all there being considered. But those are the issues that I see, and I think audit in particular are going to have to take on board. So will this report format be taken forward? Because I think you should, and stick to it. And particularly for audit and accounts, it would be very helpful to have this sort of report in this sort of way on those sorts of things that we look at. Thank you.
So in terms of the organisational resilience and the recruitment freeze, I think it's fair to say that we're not, if there is a requirement for a permanent member of staff, the only reason we would have an interim in place, or should only have an interim in place, is if actually there's a need, a service need, whilst we actually go through the permanent recruitment. So, for example, I'm happy to put my hands in the air and say I've got an interim head of finance at the moment, because my head of finance left, and not to have a head of finance at this particular time probably wouldn't be a great idea for the council. But the actual permanent recruitment is about to go out to advert literally in the next couple of days. And therefore, we're assessing each post on a case-by-case basis. You're absolutely right in the operations team, and I think that Tom Payne has responded to you specifically about one particular issue. There may well be the need to have interims in place whilst, again, they do the permanent recruitment, so they can actually try to keep on top of the work programme, as well as dealing with any additional responsibilities as a result of COVID and any additional restrictions in the way in which they can work. So, suddenly got an echo. So you're absolutely right. We are taking that under advisement, and would completely agree with you. It would be false economy to have interims in place if actually there's no service need, or the fact that we're not actually undergoing permanent recruitment. So it would absolutely be our intention to make sure that we're taking on agency staff as and when we need to, but for a service purpose. And if you think there are some specific examples that we're not aware of, or I'm not particularly aware of, I'm happy to kind of pick up that issue with the relevant executive director. I hope it's not me. Having said all of that. And absolutely, in terms of property rents, very high on the agenda. Regular updates are clearly to myself, but also to the property board generally. Lots of discussions, as you would imagine, going on at the moment with a variety of different businesses whose payment holidays are coming to an end, to understand how we can work together to ensure that they are, they're able to sort of continue to operate their business within the borough. And obviously we're providing updates, and there is an update to Audit and Accounts Committee next week on our current position on that. I believe the paper is being sent out as a supplementary agenda item. So yes, you're absolutely right. And I think in terms of businesses more generally, clearly it's something that we continue to support the lobbying for in terms of central government and additional funding for those businesses, as well as additional support.
Oops, sorry, I was muted. Councillor Harvey, you got any supplementary questions? Okay, great. Councillor McCormack, who's next on my list?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, thanks, Sue, and all the officers for producing this very comprehensive report. I'll just keep it brief. But there's been a budget gap identified of 2.21 million. How critical is that to our finances?
In terms of the expectation that we'll have a budget gap at year end, we expect it to be very minimal after the income compensation scheme. So from that point of view, I think in year we will probably end the year with a balanced budget. So from that point of view, I don't think it's, you know, as others have mentioned, we are very fortunate in terms of the financial stability of the council and our ability to be able to react to these things. So therefore, I think that, you know, from the question you've asked, I think the risk is very low.
Okay. Any further supplementary, Councillor McCormack?
No, that's fine, Chair.
And Councillor Ashfield, you was my last speaker at the moment.
Thank you. On the back of the Council's medium-term financial strategy review of public conveniences, is the Council really that hard up that residents and visitors to Whitchurch and Overton won't be able to spend a penny after April next year?
I suspect that's a question for the portfolio holder.
Yeah, I thought you might think that. So I suppose obviously every budget proposal has to be considered. We are in a position where we're having to make more difficult decisions year on year, and it's a case of prioritising frontline services. So for the toilets, I think it's a case of if local, if the town council similar wants to take that over, then that's the sort of discussions we can have. Obviously, if there are people who are already doing maintenance activities in the local area of Whitchurch, then that's going to be a more cost-effective way of doing it. But I think for a very specific question like that, you might be better off talking to Councillor Hayley Eachus, because she's responsible for loos.
Thank you. I will do that.
Okay. Anybody else got any further questions? Okay. Again, this is important to be noted by the looks of it. So thank you very much to the office for all the hard work, and our finances look a lot stronger than I was expecting, to be honest. Well, tell the announcements today anyway. So thank all your staff for a sterling job. And then so next item on the agenda is the forward plan. We've had one person put in 2 requests for things to go on the forward plan. So did they get circulated again today? Okay. So
we circulated them yesterday, and don't forget there's also the finance paper that will be coming in November as well.
Okay, so we've got a finance paper coming in November. Councillor Miller.
Yes, Chair, thanks. I had hoped to bring a report to this committee on the S106 task and finish group. Now, that really has to be put into November is the earliest. I've got a statement that we do have, if you recall, we had a modified flowchart done earlier this year. And we know that Environment and the Planning Department are liaising directly now with ward councillors on the scoping side. That's only part of what I hope to bring to the committee. We have a bit of a log jam to take this on a little bit further as to the process that all councillors really have asked for and need to have as a proper understanding of the S106 distribution management and everything else. I'm afraid I have to say that the logjam seems to be in finance. And it's not because of what Sue just mentioned about a head of finance disappearing. It's just that the finance department has been working very, very hard in the last few months, which I fully understand. And all I want to say is that I've been given an assurance, hopefully, that we've now got an established view, as we see in this report, of the finances caused by COVID. And unless we have something very dramatic happen, that now the work can be done to finalize that report from the task and finish group. And I would, as it's mentioned on page 59 here, I'd like to make sure that that comes to this committee as a report in November on the 24th, I believe it is. Thank you.
So we've got that. So we've got that there's one item for the next agenda. And the 6th one is, we've got the, I can't remember what you called it now, Sadie.
I think it was a finance or budget paper that Sue mentioned at the pre-meet that was going to go to Cabinet and then come to us.
In a finance paper that's going to come as well in November. And then there's the 2 papers that Kim put forward if the committee want to accept them as for items. Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Taylor, myself and others who were at the last audit committee raised a number of questions around the major projects issues, and I think the work request is timely, to say the least. In that context, we've been promised a constitutional working party for a long time, and nobody has sought to organise, to my knowledge, or anything around that recently, for obvious reasons, with everything that's been going on. So I totally understand why. But would it be a task and finish panel that this committee would seek to set up regarding the major projects element? Would it be the constitutional working party that it should sit with? Where should this be done? Because it shouldn't be just kicked into the long grass. It does need to be tackled. And if we're looking to a new authority next year, all the shape and form of that needs to be thought through. But the context of having a major projects committee or some sort of body that specifically oversight of major projects is very relevant, and I wholly support that, and would hope it would get a good hearing somewhere appropriate and not just kicked into the long grass.
Sue would like to make comment. So.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So as part of setting up the Project Management Office, obviously we've developed a suite of reports which give further updates and highlights around each of the major projects. One of the things we're developing, and it can come to Scrutiny Committee rather than Performance Panel, but obviously the intention is, as previously discussed at Performance Panel, a need around greater oversight on the projects. We've developed information to go to the Performance Panel. However, if it would be useful to bring it to Scrutiny itself, so we can actually go through the current process that we use and the resulting summary that we'll be bringing, which gives you some assurance around the way we monitor risk and the progress on each of the reports, I'd be happy to do that.
If Councillor Harvey would like to bring that, there's a form that if you can fill it out and bring it to the committee so that we go through the proper way of doing it. Sadie can send you the form. I think Sadie's about to say something.
I think Councillor Kim Taylor's already done that. That's Councillor Harvey was talking about the suggestion.
All right, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, so we if the committee agree that would come as a paper in November. Later than that.
Sorry.
If I may, Chair, forgive me. I don't want to. Kim can talk to herself in terms of the paper she's produced. I don't want to cut across that in any way. But I think, with respect to Sue, the kind of conversation at audit became much bigger than just the financial performance element. It's the oversight of the major projects, be it from a planning perspective, however you wanted to look at it, but it's the oversight. And then the strength of the Bennydown Overview Committee has been that it has been able to do that on such a major project. So is that an area that might evolve itself? And another councillor from one of the other groups came up with that idea, that actually perhaps it might evolve into something in the future in the new council. Who knows? That's the point. It's the broader issues that need picking up in a better way, perhaps, of oversight.
Sorry, yeah. So sorry. The process we're developing is not about the financial monitoring of the projects. It's the overall monitoring of the projects. So there isn't actually an element in there that says this is the cost of the project and this is what we spent, etc. Although there is a budget element, it's actually a more wider piece. And in terms of the constitutional piece, I think that's something we'd have to pick up as part of the constitution review, which of course will at some point have to go through the constitutional working group in terms of looking at what all the committees are. But we've certainly done a huge amount of work around how we monitor each of the projects over a number of different strands. And that's what we want to bring back. And I say I don't mind whether we could bring it to on a regular basis as part of Performance Panel, because I think we need to take an update and have some transparency around the major projects. But I'm happy to do an initial briefing to Scrutiny in terms of where we are on that.
Is that something that the rest of the committee would like to see?
Second one down, second one did have his hand up.
All right, Councillor Kim Taylor, I think, was to put in.
Yeah, sorry. Sorry, can you hear me okay? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I think really what we're talking about here is, I mean, there are elements, aren't there? Monitoring, review and evaluation are not all the same things. They are very different things. And whilst I get that there will be processes already around, you know, perhaps setting goals and project management and those sorts of things, where we got to in audit is, one, audit didn't necessarily know what they were, and two, there was a real concern about oversight. And oversight and governance is slightly different than project monitoring. And one of the issues that kept coming through is that the people that were making the decisions were also the people that were exercising oversight, and you can't mark your own homework. And so really what I think we were looking at in audit to pass to scrutiny was for the scrutiny committee to review the current arrangements and to think about what future arrangements might need to be put in place in respect of monitoring, evaluation and review, which includes oversight. And if necessary, as a result of that review and examination, there may well then be work for places, for other committees or the Constitutional Committee to take on board the recommendations for that. But at the moment, the Audit Committee were not in love with the current oversight position. I mean, that's as much as I can say about that really. It's coming from that work.
So I will take some guidance from the officers. So basically you're saying there's two parts. There's one for the current position, and then you want to look at the future on how we could do this as a long-term scheme. So maybe the Constitutional Working Party might have to recommend how we do that within the council, but if she wants to come in.
Yeah, so that's absolutely fine, Councillor Taylor. I think that we can bring something that says this is what we're currently doing. So obviously I think what we reflected at Audit and Accounts Committee is that Audit and Accounts Committee responsibility is about whether the governance is in place, but obviously it's not the appropriate place to take the specific details of each of the projects. So I'd be very happy to bring something back to try and address those issues that can actually then stimulate the conversation in terms of the next steps. We in the interim will be bringing information back via the performance panel anyway, as what those projects are now and how they're performing. And obviously any feedback is obviously greatly welcome. And then in terms of any steps after that point, of course, Scrutiny could seek to have a report on any of the major projects as they see fit if there are concerns around the projects, but would suggest you do that after we've kind of brought back a kind of overall summary on how we're planning to approach it. And then obviously you can, as you say, suggest next steps for others to consider.
Okay, yeah, I understand now. Sadie, have you got that so that we know for the next agenda?
But could I ask that it's not November?
Not for
because obviously we're getting the budget report ready. So,
the budget report.
could we do it in the following meeting?
Is the next one February after that?
Yeah, I believe so. But I'll mark it that it's obviously not November. It'll be the one after that.
Okay, is can we happy with that?
We will be taking it to performance panel, which I think we're in the process of just setting one up, I think, because we haven't had one for a while.
Yeah, we'd hope to have a performance panel, but before, well, in between that and the next scrutiny meeting.
Excellent. So we've got the SO 106 for November, the budget, the review for the meeting after, and then Kim, the papers you circulated.
There was also the second one, which was the pandemic one.
Pandemic one. Do you want to
I
speak?
don't know whether that's been answered at all, Councillor Taylor.
Right, thank you very much. I mean, this particular item, I mean, there's a very tiny overlap with, potential tiny overlap with CEP, except for the fact that CEP can't look at the future until it knows about the past, and the past is very much something that we need to look at. And this is very specific about actually reviewing the effectiveness of the support that we provided as a council to the voluntary sector during the pandemic, and whether or not our approach was the most effective thing that we could have done, and whether it represented value for money. And really, the CEP can't consider going forward what we might want to do until we've actually really reviewed and understood what we've done in the past. And so that's what this is about, really, is about looking at what we did quite specifically and being being quite you know, quantitative about what we've done, not just qualitative.
Is there any comments from the committee on that? Councillor Faulkner?
Right, yeah. Yeah, I mean, Councillor Taylor's report was very comprehensive. Tonight I felt a bit like a loss adjuster trying to assess storm damage, knowing that tomorrow there's a forecast for an even bigger one. and therefore I thought that perhaps that should be looked at earlier next year, when hopefully we've ridden through this next bit and we've got more details about what has happened and how we then responded to what might be following up, but which we don't as yet know what it is. So I would suggest that, yes, it's a good idea, but maybe for earlier next year rather than, say, the November.
Okay. Have the officers got a view on that?
Obviously, it's not my area. So I did agree with Councillor Taylor following the pre-brief yesterday that I would take it up with the appropriate executive director. Obviously, there is a lot of information in terms of what we have done, which could potentially be scrutinised now. But obviously, there is some merit in terms of, obviously, are all the things that we've got in place still working as a result of the next phase? So I'm happy to be directed by the committee.
Okay. So, Councillor Taylor, as it was your...
Yeah, I mean, I understand the points that Councillor Faulkner's making, that this is a very fast-moving and dynamic set of circumstances, but I suppose one of the things that is of concern is that if we identify things that we might have done better or sooner or quicker or more effectively, or if the voluntary sector and BVA come to us and say, well, actually, this bit of help here would have been really, you know, with hindsight would have been really, really helpful, we're going to miss the opportunities to deploy that in the second wave. So part of me understands the fact that the situation is changing around us, but
Kim, you've lost your voice. Kim, your voice suddenly cut off then. Right. So I'm looking for guidance from the committee. Would they prefer it to come, as Kim suggested, at the next meeting or further? Councillor Miller.
I think, Chair, that I tend to agree with Councillor Faulkner. We don't know what's around the corner at the moment. We are desperately hoping it's not going to be a repeat of the spring. You can have an initial review in November. I don't see any problem with that. But by November, we might be having a very different conversation. So it's the uncertainty, I think, that is raising the issue here. Yeah, start the work, but be prepared to be flexible in how we progress it.
Councillor McKay, you indicated.
Yeah, I just wondered if we're in a position to ask BVA to come to the committee and give us what you might call a flash report. Rather than the council do work in the first instance, let's ask the organisation that really is at the front line to come and give us their top 5 observations, perhaps. So not asking them to do a lot of work, but to give us the sort of priority feedback, because I think Councillor Taylor's right. The sooner we've got some feel for where things could be done better, there's a chance that it could influence things for better over the next few months.
You know, just I actually think that's a very good suggestion. Would you be happy with that, Councillor Taylor, that we invite BVA to November if the agenda's not too heavy, and then we have a further report next year from the officers, because I think it's going to change a lot in the next few months before we get to that point for a report. So,
Absolutely, I'm quite happy with that, because I think that it means we're taking some steps not to capitalise on opportunities to support residents, and we already know that, you know, it's not just going to be the new COVID things that we'll have, but also the increase in general hardship as people start to lose their jobs and so on. And so getting some feedback from BVA about their sort of top 5 hit list, I think would be really useful for us going forward, and then a fuller review as things pan out a bit more.
has the rest of the committee agreed with that? Yep. And the officers, will you be able to arrange that?
Yeah, so Chair, just to confirm that the committee is then requesting a report for January, which I believe is the next scrutiny meeting after November, with regards to the major projects, and in the interim, the performance panel will have some information fed back to them. And then we would like BVA to come and just sort of provide their top observations and priorities at which the council could have done better, or at which the council has done well at our next November meeting.
Yeah, that's
and we'll go from there. Okay, yeah, agreed.
That'd be fantastic. Councillor Miller.
Just a reminder, the CEO of BVA is a member of this committee.
Yeah, I don't know if he'd have to substitute himself, or, but yeah.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Declaration of interest today.
Yeah, you have to ask yourself his own questions. Yeah, so if everybody's happy with the future work programme, there's no urgent emergency items. What's it called? No need to exclude the press because there's no confidential exempt items. So that's the end of the meeting. Thank you everyone for your time.